This is where I say good morning a few times to encourage us along. So I'll just say it one more time. Good morning. And my name is Rob Doyle, and I'm in our Customer and Stakeholder Relations group at the IESO. I'll act as your MC today. So I really want to thank you for joining us here at the 2017 IESO Stakeholder Summit. So before I turn the podium over and get out of the way, I just want to talk a little bit about how the day works and give you a few administrative notes just to make us all a little bit more comfortable. Really, I think I have two main jobs. The first one is to give you information so that really we're making sure we're all on the same page. And I want to keep the discussions flowing as well. So part of keeping the discussions flowing is making sure that we're all on time. So I'm going to need all of us to kind of partner with me to making sure that we're on time. So thank you for doing that so far. We will, in breaks and over lunch as well, I'll come up and give a 2-minute warning just so that we can be ready to go. So 4 administrative notes for you. The first one is that you may or may not have noticed that we have a photographer on site who will be taking pictures for some of the IESO collateral that we have. So if that is something that you don't want to be a part of, please just flag your name to the registration desk and we'll make sure that, that you're not included in any collateral that we have coming from this event. The second one is you received a delegate package on the way in. Those have full bios for all of our speakers, so please take a look through those so that you can really get a sense of really the breadth of their experience that they're bringing to the summit here today. The third administrative note is emergency exit. So obviously we all know that if something happens in an emergency situation, the response is not to run as fast as we can towards the doors. The response is to really there are emergency exits out of both doors here. So we want to make sure that we're moving toward those in a calm and orderly manner, and Beanfield staff will be here to assist us in anything that we need as well. Fourth is that we're really excited about the speaker lineup that we have here today, but we want to make sure that you're invested in the day and you have a chance to interact with our speakers as well. So you will notice that there are 2 stationary mics in the middle, so when prompted by speakers for questions, please feel free to approach those and ask your question. Otherwise, you'll notice that there's some yellow cards on your desk that you can hold those up high, and a member of our IESO team will come and grab those from you. So with that, I'd now like to give the podium over to Terry Young, who's the Vice President of Conservation and Corporate Relations at the IESO, and Terry will officially open up the 2017 summit.
Okay, honestly, I got more applause at the Butter Tart Festival I was a judge at than I'm getting this morning, so let's try to get into it if we could. Thank you very much. That's great, excellent. Just to remember that we've got people up here, if you could keep that in mind as well, that's great. Thanks. As Rob mentioned, my name is Terry Young. I'm Vice President with the IESO. Great to have everybody here this morning. You know, this is actually a first for us as a merged entity, is to hold a stakeholder summit, and I'm hoping that it's going to become an annual tradition, that we're going to be able to once a year get stakeholders across the province together and from outside the province and make this an annual event. We have done some of this in our previous lives. The OPA, the IESO did this, but as I said, it's the first time that we're doing this as a merged entity. But we are building on our collective experience in delivering the summit. We're also going to have 5 regional forums later in the year. We're going to be in across Ontario in 5 different locations, getting the communities engaged. And you're going to hear a little bit about this in the agenda about community engagement, and it's very important for us, and ask you to stay tuned for further details around our regional summits that we're going to have in the fall. But before I get into a few remarks, I just want to acknowledge the efforts of a few people. These events don't happen overnight. They take a dedication of a lot of people, and at the IESO we had 10 folks who were driving this summit, led by Rob Doyle, who you heard from as well. But Agatha Pierka, Daniela Drazik, Jason Gerbovic, June Tu, Nicole Heinem, Rick Romeo, Ryan King, Susan Harrison, and Tim Butters. Those 10 individuals, deserve a round of applause for organizing this one as well. But we also had a lot of input from our stakeholder advisory committee in doing this. And again, we're well represented by SAC today. I see a number of individuals from SAC. And for those who don't know, our SAC members represent consumers, generators, distributors, transmitters, related businesses, services in Ontario communities. And James Skonyak, the vice chair at SAC, is going to be speaking shortly. So in addition to thanking our SACs and for their ongoing advice and stewardship, I'd also like to thank the collection of speakers and presenters who have joined us all here today, all who have taken time out from their busy schedules to share their thoughts and wisdoms with us. It's great to see so many people in the room today. It's a great room, actually. It's a big room, but for claustrophobics like myself, this is a nice room to be in. Networking is a big part of it, so we do have breaks scheduled, and hope you'll take time to reach out and talk to your colleagues and get to know one another. In bringing together experts and energy leaders from across North America today, our aim is to generate discussion and hear perspectives on how other jurisdictions throughout the continent are approaching their own shifting energy landscapes and the opportunities emerging to address some of the changing conditions that we're seeing. As a quick primer on Ontario, our province's energy landscape has been transformed in the last 10 years. We have taken 6,000 megawatts of installed coal-fired capacity out of the system and replaced them with renewables, natural gas-fired, demand response resources, and refurbished nuclear. Over the last decade, Ontarians have also saved almost 10 billion kilowatt hours through conservation and energy efficiency, which helps to lower demand and enable the IESO to defer or avoid the need to build new infrastructure. And while the nuclear refurbishments will continue to ensure that we have a strong supply of baseload energy for decades to come, we're seeing increasing amounts of generation embedded in the distribution system. Evolutions in technology and policy are expanding opportunities for customer engagement and participation, and we're going to hear about some of these opportunities today. Distributed energy resources are contributing to a system more characterized by two-way flows rather than one-way flows, delivery from large central stations, and new resources are increasingly being located to loads and demand centers on the lower voltage distribution centers. We now have about 2,000 megawatts of solar embedded within the LDC territories. So the evolution of the distribution system to include more energy resources and a more active role for the consumer is also resulting in a need for us as the system operator to understand the impact of these changes on the operation of the bulk power system. We're working with stakeholders to develop cost-effective solutions to address these challenges, both in terms of scheduling resources, enhancing system flexibility, and correcting variations in power system frequency. And with this rapidly evolving sector, we've also seen the rise, adoption, and entry of new technologies and innovations related to embedded generation storage, conservation, and renewables. It's a strategic juncture to have the kind of discussion that we're going to have today. Take a look at the future of the sector. At current levels, Ontario's electricity system is well positioned to meet provincial needs well into the 2020s, while continuing to adapt to significant change across the sector and the evolution of policy decisions. Looking forward, the IESO will be developing an implementation plan to support the upcoming long-term energy plan and completing a midterm review of the Conservation First framework. This work is aimed at better preparing the IESO and the sector generally for the future challenges and opportunities ahead. Also in the years ahead, some of the IESO efforts will fundamentally reshape the way that our electricity market functions. Through the Market Renewal Program, the IESO will redesign Ontario's wholesale electricity markets to provide greater transparency, promote competition, and deliver more efficient outcomes. Working with stakeholders, we intend to lay a foundation that will prepare us for the electricity sector of tomorrow. So in a relatively short period, Ontario's supply mix has undergone a major shift, which has changed the dynamics of our electricity system. However, all across North America, system operators and policymakers are addressing new challenges as their supply mixes evolves. And given the complex interdependencies of a changing North America energy sector, the role of collaboration and shared learning is critically important, which again brings me back to today's session, which we hope will provide a broader perspective on North America's energy sector and offer in-depth analysis on a range of emerging energy trends that are shaping the next generation of electricity systems. Today's agenda offers an entry point into these discussions. It includes an exploration of distributed energy networks and decarbonization from the perspective of real-time system operations, emerging electricity markets, as well as long-term system planning. So I look forward to some really good discussion today, both in the room and outside the room. And now I'd ask James Cognac, the Vice Chair of SAC, to come up and have some remarks as well. Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Geez, that's better than the judging at the butter tart. Hey, look, thanks very much for having me here today. As Terry mentioned, my name is James Cognac. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Bruce Power, but today I'm here as the Vice Chair of SAC, and that's the hat I have on today. You know, Terry mentioned the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. You know, it's a very interesting forum and a very innovative forum, frankly, that I think the IESO has established with the SAC. The SAC represents the entire sector, and you really get a collective group of people around the table for the SAC meetings, and we don't all agree on whether it's supply mix or various programs, but we're able to come together and give IESO management and the public you know, our thoughts, our perspectives as to how we move the sector forward. But one of the things that I have learned participating in the SAC, and I'm going to come back in a minute or two to the role of SAC and how it ties in today, is that no matter what your view of the electricity system is in Ontario, no matter what you think has gone right, what you think has gone wrong, what should be in the LTEP, what shouldn't be in the LTEP, the one thing that I think all SAC members would agree on is we have a tremendously dedicated group of staff at the IESO. Right up to senior management, all the staff that work at the IESO, and I can tell you they're truly committed to stakeholder interaction. They bend over backwards to meet information requests, to make these forums work. So, you know, let's give this the IESO staff a round of applause for all their hard work. They work incredibly hard and deserve our thanks. Now that you've copped, you can complain on some other things the rest of the day. But it's really important we recognize there's people running the IESO and they, you know, day in and day out work as hard as they can to drive our system forward. The IESO SAC over the course of the last number of months has focused on a number of key priorities. We reviewed the conservation framework, market renewal, the business planning process for the IESO that goes to the Ontario Energy Board. Of course, there's been a lot of conversation on the Climate Change Action Plan, and as Terry mentioned, the long-term energy plan. Certainly, it's a really busy time for electricity and energy in Ontario. But what I think is most important is that we continue as a sector to recognize we're all in this together. That at the end of the day, we as a electricity sector in Ontario, and you look at the size of the electricity sector, it's the size of an economy of a small province. It's massive. And it's incumbent upon all of us to do our best and to give our policymakers the best advice possible to make the system work. Not only from a day-to-day reliability perspective, and that's something we often forget about when we're looking at the IESO, that, you know, there's really two elements to the IESO. There's that day-to-day operational piece, which I hate to say it, but we often take for granted. And then there's also the policy implementation piece. But from our perspective, and I know all members of the SAC would agree with this, it's really important that we continue to be transparent, open, that we have a lot of engagement, not only in rooms like this, but in smaller rooms across Ontario. We all have the opportunity to provide input, and I think our electricity system in Ontario will be better off as a result of that input. Just the fact that we had to secure a room of this size for a stakeholder summit says something in itself, but more importantly, all of you are taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. And I think what the IESO SAC and the IESO broadly is committed to doing is listening to your input and acting on it as best we can. So thank you very much for being here. I hope you have a fantastic day, and we look forward to continuing to work together to move our sector forward. Thank you.
So thank you, Terry and James, for that introduction and officially opening our time here. I'd like to now introduce Nat Bullard, the head of content of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, joining us today from Washington, D.C. I had originally intended to read a couple of sentences from Nat's bio that you all have in your package, but just in talking with him before the summit started today, just someone who has such a keen insight, not only into renewable energy, into trends and insights across North America, but somebody who really understands trends in energy management, how the consumer is using electricity, how the consumer is using electricity smarter, but then also how that's playing in a broader policy scale. So with that, Nat, thank you for being here today. The podium is yours.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Terry and James, as well, for the opener. And actually, that was a perfect bio. Reading an analyst bio is always a little bit tedious, and it reminds me of the first time I met a relative who was an engineer, and I asked where he worked, and he said ITT. And I said, well, what is ITT? And he's like, well, it's I talk and travel. And that's essentially, as an analyst, what you do as well. You fly around and you talk to people. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here because it's a very, very intriguing time to be thinking about long-term energy planning when there's a great deal of short-term noise. There are some short-term signals as well, but it's really a very, very, how should we say, high context environment right now for thinking about energy planning. So what I've brought is a look across the big drivers of system change. So technology, demand, finance, and policy. And I've split it up 4 ways. And I've had a lot of experience doing this over the last 10 years, leading with figures on investment, leading with figures on deployment and things like that. But I've recently put together a new section, and it's actually shown for the first time here, and that's essentially how we got to now. So how did we get to the system and globally the trends that are driving these systems, given what's happened over the past, say, 4 decades worth of technology, finance, and deployment. So how we got to now. I think the one-sentence version is that the best way to think about our electricity systems in the future is that they are primarily technology-driven rather than primarily resource-based. It's not that resource goes away, but that technology and the speed and the facility with which technology can be deployed tends to be a bigger driver of system change than what resources are in the mix, right? This is probably the best one of these that you've got as an example. You are now looking at a solar cost that is down 99%, in fact, actually more than 99% since 1975, and more than a 100,000x increase in cumulative installations, right? We're probably on pace to have about 1 terawatt of installed solar in the world sometime middle of next decade, which is really quite extraordinary for a technology that began in a laboratory that was then deployed only for satellites, right? But there's a pathway from technologies that are expensive and inefficient and have very, very bounded sets of applications towards something that ends up being pretty much the cheapest and most ubiquitous marginal source of electrons anywhere. In the last 11 years of deployment of clean energy, we've seen annual installations that have gone up about 4-fold. We've also seen cumulative investment go up around about the same amount. And in the asset finance world, which is the bulk of all of the money that goes into renewable energy sector, we've also seen a great big shift in where that money is going, right? So it was primarily an OECD thing when it began, right? So this was Europe, it was the United States, it was the developed parts of rich Asia. It's now flipped around quite a bit. So just last year, China was more than 1/3 of all investment. And the rest of the world, too, is a big component of where those dollars are going. So when we think about this, we should think about it, again, tying back to technology, that every dollar deployed helps drive technology costs down. So if the investment is going in China, the benefits accrue to anybody who's later on going to invest anywhere, really. We've also seen power sector emissions peak in many major economies, and I think that this is often overlooked. The last couple of years, we've actually had flat global power sector emissions, which is pretty extraordinary if you can consider how much growth there still is in electricity demand around the world. What's also worth noting is that this has happened very different ways in different places, right? So China has managed to actually have declining emissions for the last couple of years, even with a power mix that is about 70% coal, right? OECD Europe, and I use Germany here as a proxy for that, has managed to have declining emissions using about 50% coal. The United States actually has the least coal of any of the systems that I put in this mix, and we're now in the United States down to the same power sector emissions levels as the early 1990s. And for that, actually, you don't really thank renewable energy, you really thank natural gas, because natural gas is now the single largest generation fuel that we have in the United States. Bigger than nuclear, bigger than renewables, although we have recently passed the point where wind on a generation basis is very, very close to hydro. And then you have a country like India, right? And India is some place that still has 300 million people that are waiting to join the electricity grid in a reliable way, and it's about 75% coal. So what happens in India is actually going to be much more consequential for the future of power emissions than what happens in the US or in the OECD. And that applies here in Canada. I'm a bit remiss in not pulling Ontario data. I simply was not prepared for the ease with which I could get granular data from the government. I'm not used to this. I spent 4 years living in Asia where it's pulling teeth to get data on anything from anybody. But if I'd put Ontario in here, it's down about 8% since 1990 in terms of total emissions. And that, I have to say, is quite an admirable generation mix if you're looking to decarbonize. Well done. It's, it's not something that a lot of countries can claim to have this much low carbon energy already in the system. This is perhaps not hugely relevant here in Ontario, but it is very important to look at something that is changing globally in the gas market, and that is that there is now a global gas market. The reason I say that it's relevant here is because as gas gets global, things that are in pipelines tend to start having global prices, and they might get a bit spikier than they had been in the past. But what's really, really notable here is that LNG is now something that is traded on a spot basis. It is destination flexible, and volumes are going up, and it's oversupplied through about the middle of next decade. So you're going to see a gas market that's a lot more interesting, shall we say, than it used to be. Electric vehicles are doing quite well. We're now at about 1 million electric vehicles sold in the last year, and we've got more than 150 models up in the last 10 years from really only about 10 total electric vehicle models. US, Europe, all growing markets. Japan, a slightly shrinking market, and China is up about 40-fold in terms of electric vehicles sold in the last 10 years. The last 4 years. And briefly, Tesla was the most valuable US automaker. I put this slide up and I had to briefly caveat on there because it's market cap and enterprise value and you never really know what's going to happen. But actually what happened on Friday is that Tesla not only passed these two folks here in North America, but also passed BMW in terms of enterprise value. Now, that tells you nothing about the fundamentals of their business, but it does give you some indication of where people view the future going. So rather than dig deep into sort of investment in renewable energy and the figures that a lot of my colleagues have typically given, I want to lead on sort of ways of thinking about electricity demand. And the first one is what my colleagues very rightly call with pride the most beautiful chart in the world. And this is this very, very complex analysis of electricity consumption and GDP per capita. We've only run it through 2012. That tells you something about how challenging it is to get data from a lot of these smaller countries that don't report very well or report really at all. But look, the simple message is this: as countries get rich, they need fewer units of electricity per unit of GDP, right? And this is pretty much universal. And there's many, many ways to think about that, right? Obviously, there's changes in the industrial mix. There is, to some extent, deindustrialization as industrial capacity and output goes to new places. But there's another element that I want to pull in that's some work that I've looked at recently, and that is about the changing nature of the things that people consume as well as they get wealthier. This is data from the US, this is from the Energy Information Administration on household electronics. And I'll show you in a moment why this is so important. This is a complex chart, but it's actually a really, really important one, because what we have here is this view on the things that people have in their homes. Excuse me. I don't really have a cold. I've just got a 2-year-old in daycare, and that means that I've got a pretty much constant cough. We think about things like TVs as being omnipresent in houses, right? But they're not really. TVs and the peripherals that go with them, which for those of you who take a look at residential electricity use are a big part of the sort of passive draw or the vampire load in a house, are really the province, to be fair, of the old, right? And the things that use less electricity are more or less the province of the young. But you could think about this in classical demographic terms as one of those sort of pig in a python charts, right? As people get older, they tend to bring these things with them, right? So we'll see these demographics shift as they get older, right? That smartphone chart will start to shift more towards the middle and then further up. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because of this. The electricity draw from those devices that people tend to have in older homes it's not nothing, it's not also huge, but it's something, right? So it's 40 watts for a set-top box with a digital video recorder. It's 30-something watts for just a plain set-top box. But this is why that matters. Desktop computer uses about half that much. A laptop computer uses about a third as much as a DVR. A VCR, a DVD player, which most people don't really even have anymore, use even less electricity. And then an Apple TV and an iPad on no load use really almost nothing, right? So to put it another way, in order to make up the electricity load from getting rid of one set-top box with a DVR, you'd have to install about 140-something Apple TVs in the house, right? Those of you who know this classic Jevons paradox that we consume more of something as it gets less expensive, and those of you who are thinking of a substitution effect from one to the other should be a bit cautious because there really isn't one. You're replacing the same service in using an Apple TV in place of a set-top box or a DVR, but you're not going to put 150 Apple TVs in the house to replace that missing electricity demand. The same thing definitely applies with lighting as well, right? There are really only so many lumens that humans can stand. So if lighting technology gets much, much better, as LEDs become cheaper and as more and more people deploy them, they don't tend to over-illuminate their house just because illumination is that much cheaper. They're tending to use the same amount of illumination that they are, just eliminating a load along the way. There's another big element that's happening around the world, really, in electricity demand that's a challenge. So if you're thinking that corporate load growth, and in particular places that use, companies that use a great deal of electricity, in particular the tech sectors, yes, they do, but they're tending to take their new demand, if not somewhere else, then at least into a different fashion than just buying bulk power from their power utility. The world's biggest companies now are doing direct procurement of renewable energy. And this is just statistics from the people in calendar year 2016 and their top 10 acquisitions. But look, you've got 650 megawatts worth of new power contracted from Amazon, 565 megawatts of it from Google, Microsoft. You get the idea here going down the list of what types of companies they are. But it's also places like the Department of Defense, and it's also things like Norsk Hydro, right? So companies that are opting to get a lot of their new incremental demand from renewable energy. And also through a set of commitments called the RE100, opting one way or another to get all of their electricity from renewable power in timeframes ranging from right now all the way up to, in the case of one company in China, 2045. But either way, you're seeing a lot of new demand being met in a new way, rather than just from buying through the utility. You know, if you look at that on a total basis, you know, we're talking about 6 gigawatts of contracts a year in 2015, slightly less than that last year, and a mix that's actually increasingly diverse. So it's not just in the Americas. Why does it matter? Well, it's helpful to get a sense for the load that we're talking about, right? So, you know, Rio Tinto is also a Czech Republic in terms of its electricity demand, right? A Nestle is a Hungary in terms of electricity demand. And the more companies like this start to opt for an alternate way to get their electricity, the more it means there's a need for nimble behavior or a change of business model even for many of their electrical counterparties. A bit about finance, because it is always very important to see where the money is going, and not only that, how it is going, what structures people are using to deploy it. You know, I look at this from an institutional investor's perspective these days. So not just the sort of traditional arranged project financing and non-recourse debt that goes for an asset that is a limited liability corporation. This is the classic way to build a wind farm or a solar park. These days, I tend to look at it much more from a very big, broad canvas of about $71 trillion worth of institutional assets and money. And I start from this first principle, which is looking at the asset base of fixed and long-term assets that are owned by energy-intensive companies. So not just companies that generate energy, but companies that also use it. And it's about $10 trillion worth of assets, right? So if you've got $71 trillion worth of institutional money, about $1 out of every 7 of it, one way or another, is concerned with the long-term assets that are locked up in energy or in energy-intensive sectors. It's about 14% of all the money has, one way or another, a stake in thinking about energy and the infrastructure therein. And what that money thinks about increasingly is stuff other than coal. This is a chart that comes, unfortunately, just before the US election, but I would wager that it actually hasn't changed very much. And within this world of opportunistic money, so this is private equity, there's basically no interest in North America in investing in coal, right? There's a 9% general preference in it and a whole 0% targeting investment in 12 months. Now, the most important thing about this chart is that it deserves to be revisited right now and to see after the presidential election and after the US withdrawing from a non-binding voluntary commitment called the Paris Agreement to see if that's changed at all. But I'll wager that it hasn't moved substantially. And it definitely will not have moved up to the level of interest in renewable energy, in natural gas, or in oil. I said that we've got a lot of institutional money involved, and that institutional money invests in things like ExxonMobil. It also invests in big resources companies. And it was intriguing for those who don't watch this on an everyday basis to see that companies like ExxonMobil had a vested interest and a stated interest in staying in the Paris Climate Agreement, right? This is the new CEO who replaced the man that went on to become the Secretary of State in the US. And he said that, I believe and my company believes that climate risks warrant action, right? And it's going to take all of us to make meaningful progress, right? We saw this in the run-up to the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement very consistently. The bigger the company, the more global it was, the more interest it had in a stable, long-term view of reduced emissions and the commitments that would be required to do that. One of the reasons that a person like Darren Wood says something like that publicly is because he has shareholders like BlackRock, for instance. BlackRock has, oh, and I should update this as well, not 5.1 trillion, but 5.4 trillion worth of assets under management. And very recently it disclosed what it calls its investment stewardship priorities for the next 2 years worth of investing. And I noted this very closely, that one of its 5 priorities is climate risk disclosure. So one way or another, if you are a company that BlackRock is invested in, which to be fair is essentially every company everywhere, then you probably have to have some position on climate risk disclosure because it's being required of you. Let's put that another way. BlackRock is part of a group of peers, and as of 2 weeks ago, about 45% of all of the dollars under management back shareholder resolutions on climate risk and disclosure about climate risk. About 55% at the moment don't, or they don't have a position yet. But that's a very, very resounding statement on behalf of climate risk disclosure and having some position on what it means for your business as a going concern. And we're starting to see that come through. So ExxonMobil, despite CEO Darren Wood's statement, was a bit recalcitrant about doing any of this disclosure for a very long time. Its shareholder resolution in 2016 got 38% support to make the risks of climate risk or the disclosure of climate risk public. Recently, so a couple of weeks ago, it had another one of these at its shareholder meeting, and it was supported 62%, with BlackRock joining a couple of other very, very big asset managers to make that happen. So consider this to be, if not priced in, then very much expected of big companies, that they will have some disclosure on what climate risk means to them. My last thing in this section is to look a little bit about why an investor might be increasingly interested in forcing this sort of disclosure. And you can only force disclosure like this if you have the opportunity to walk away from an investment, right? It's no good to do that and then essentially be handcuffed into an investment that you can't get out of because you're chasing return or you're chasing yield or liquidity or growth, right? But we have an index now that's been run since the year 2007, in this case, for me running it here, called the Fossil Free Index. And it's essentially the S&P 500 X large fossil fuel companies. And what you can see on this rebasing to the year 2007 is that actually we're seeing it start to diverge. So you're actually capable of doing essentially the S&P 500 without fossil fuels in it on an investment basis that has you definitely not taking a penalty on performance, and in fact having a slight bit of alpha above that. So when you see a trend like this, you can see all the more reason that for investors to be, shall we say, muscular in exerting their interest in climate risk disclosure and in making companies, in many cases, change their investment behavior. So the final section it's called Signals and Noise. Those of you who are familiar with Nate Silver's book, he's a statistician that wrote a lot about presidential elections. Signal and noise is a very good framework for thinking about what's happening right now. It's an exceptionally noisy time, shall we say. Even those of us who were party to the election by being US voters, we're not quite expecting all of those things that were in campaign promises and platforms to actually come to bear. But as of a couple of weeks ago, the US is now out of, as I already said, a voluntary and non-binding accord to limit emissions. And here's my way of thinking about that. And actually, the best statement comes from your own PM. And it is this. He says, we're deeply disappointed that the United States federal government has decided to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. What struck me about that instantly is the phrase federal government, right? Not the United States, but that the federal government has made that decision. I think Mr. Trudeau is in many ways channeling the fact that this is a somewhat and depending on where you are, profoundly unpopular move with most of the American electorate. And it's also not one that has really any basis whatsoever in behavior, right? As I said, non-binding and voluntary. But what he's done here, and I think very elegantly and helpfully for the rest of what I'm going to discuss, is set this up as a contrast between the federal government and the rest, right? So when one federal government does that, well, other federal governments are then welcome to lead, right? Here you see Mr. Macron and also Prime Minister Modi having quite a good chuckle as they do their own sort of bilateral agreement to work together on climate change. So if an international agreement is being, if not abrogated, then at least weakened by one party's decision to leave, putting us in the same category as Nicaragua, which thought the Paris Agreement wasn't strict enough, and Syria, which had its own reasons for not taking part, then you're going to see more country-to-country activity like this, I think. You're also going to see something that's very intriguing, and it goes back to Trudeau's point about the federal government. You're going to see things like state-to-federal agreements, right, or regional-to-federal agreements. This is unusual, I can say, having spent some time in Asia and quite close to China. It's very unusual for a state official, in this case, Governor Jerry Brown of California, to receive a president's welcome in the Great Hall of the People with Xi Jinping. This is a pretty bold statement on both of their parts, particularly on California's part to say, listen, we are going to take our own lead regardless of what happens at the federal level. And on Xi Jinping's case to say, yes, we will essentially treat you, to be fair, essentially as proxy for a federal government that we don't think is doing what seems to be the will of the people. We also have something called We're Still In, or We Are Still In. I don't think it has a contraction because it doesn't fit into a URL that way. But shortly after this withdrawal from the Paris Accord, we saw the states, cities, regional groups decide to make a commitment of their own. It's synthetic in a way because you can't actually, as a non-state actor, sign up to the Paris Agreement. But you had a bunch of these places that said, listen, we're essentially on board with this as an idea. And this numbers, which were up to date as of last week, I actually put the states that are supporting the Paris Agreement on their own and the cities that are doing it at somewhere around 1/3 of the US population, about 120 million people, and closer to 40% of GDP, right? So put it another way, that's a Mexico or a Japan worth of population that in and of itself is in a synthetic way sort of supporting the Paris Agreement. And I just think, to close it up, is that we're going to see much more of this behavior on a policy basis, right? It's a response to essentially a defederation of leadership on climate in the United States, which is quite something to be said given the role that the U.S. played in dragging the Paris Agreement together. But it's also something to bear in mind when you think about investment and when you think about behaviors, because you invest in states, right? People live in cities, and you'll see behaviors like this continue to kind of, unfortunately, polarize the way politics goes in the United States, but also to create its own centers for attraction and hopefully provide as fertile a ground for investing in the transition to a lower carbon energy sector at a state and even at a city level as it was previously at a national level. I think I've got a couple of minutes for questions. I'd be happy to take a few from the floor. I've got about 5 minutes here. Questions from anyone? If not, then you're out of school early, so to speak, and we can get on the rest of the program. But I've got one up front here, I think. Let's grab, we've got mics right there if you like. And if you'd be so kind, please tell me where you're from, so I have an idea.
Philip Andres, Next Hydrogen. I was wondering whether you have also looked at energy storage in terms of the growth of that in the context of renewable energy.
Absolutely.
And the projected growth.
No, certainly we've got that. Unfortunately, I don't have it on hand with me at the moment, but we do it primarily on a battery energy storage basis, right? That's the vector that looks most like the technologies that we've analyzed before, right? It's the one that has a similar sort of experience curve that we can track. It's also a sector that already has an industrial economy built around it. There will, of course, be some other ways to store energy over time, but that's the one that we watch the most closely because it's the one, as costs come down, that it tends to sort of eat its way into the system almost without people being aware of it, or rather, it happens with such rapidity as it did with solar that it's hard to say no to. So yeah, energy storage will be a very, very big part of what comes next. Yep, I've got one in the middle there.
Jen Hiscock with Natural Resources Canada. Does Bloomberg have any comments on carbon taxes and expected trends or reactions on that?
Let's see, carbon tax well, yes, we do. I don't have any of my own, I'm afraid. Look, carbon tax is always the ideal way, I would say, economically to incent behavior. But at least in the United States context, there's two words in carbon tax that aren't particularly popular, and that's carbon and tax. And so I think it's a very, very difficult take right now. And look, we've actually seen discussion of it come up, right? Apparently, it's somewhere in the word cloud of things that people are going to propose in this post-Paris world in the U.S., but it's very, very hard for me to handicap that. As far as elsewhere, yeah, we do have a global carbon team that does analysis on the various plans and schemes all over the world, but unfortunately, I've not got them on hand. Sorry. Hi.
Of course. We're a renewable energy developer in Ontario. So a lot of information about, thank you very much, about energy mix.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I missed about global demand. Is it in a trend maybe going up or down? And I'm curious at how that overlaps, if you have information about how companies solely concentrated on carbon-based fuels would survive in such a market.
Demand is up, and actually, you're ahead of me by about 5 days, because we'll be releasing what is our version of our 2040 outlook on electricity in the middle of the week. At that point, I'd be able to tell you all. I can't tell you anything about it now because it's still essentially being finalized. But look, no, demand goes up, but it shifts primarily towards the wind and solar technologies for generation in most parts of the world on a simply economic basis. I would say the biggest thing on the fossil fuel side that is of note, and this is a holdover from last year, will be the same again this year, is that natural gas really doesn't end up being a huge resource outside of the United States. The competition becomes not so much about gas versus coal or gas versus renewables, but the competition is almost exclusively between coal and renewable energy for the marginal units of generation all over the world. I think that's it. I'm right on time. So thank you everyone for the time. I hope that this was helpful, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
So thank you, Nat. We really appreciate you making the trek from Washington, D.C. and giving us much to consider and much to talk to. I'd like to now introduce the next panel as they start to make their way to the stage. Our panel today is moderated by Leonard Kula, the IESO Vice President of Market and System Operations. And he will lead us in this panel discussion on building flexibility into the electricity system. Leonard, who's responsible for the efficient operation of the IESO markets, safe and reliable operations, as well as emergency preparedness planning. He'll be joined on the panel by Rup Cariveau, Associate Professor at the University of Windsor. Rup is also the Director of the Environmental Energy Institute and Co-Director of the Turbulence Energy Lab at that aforementioned University of Windsor. The second member of the panel, Rob Kolbeck, is the Vice President of Energy Management at Goreway Station Partnership, and he has over 30 years of experience in ISO RTO markets, power grid management, energy trading, and demand-side management as well. And then rounding out the panel is Christian Weeks, the Vice President and General Manager of Global Demand Response for Enerdoc. Christian has over a decade of experience in energy and technology businesses and is passionate about disruptive technologies and scalable growth. So Leonard, with that, I will turn it over to you and the panel.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. So for this panel, we will begin with introductory remarks from each of the four of us. We will then open it up to the floor for any questions, and I have several pages of questions as well to throw at the panel if the questions from the floor still leave us with some time. So this panel is speaking about building flexibility into the electricity system, the tools and rules that should be considered as electricity systems integrate and manage the influx of emissions-free power. So first off, I'm going to answer the question, what do we mean by flexibility? So I took a look at the Merriam-Webster online dictionary, and one of the definitions that they've listed is flexibility is characterized by a ready capability to adapt to new, different, or changing requirements. In this context, applied to power system operations in Ontario, I think of flexibility as supply resources that are able to respond to our dispatch signals to increase output within about 30 minutes, and I'll explain why. Some recent trends. Generally, as a system operator, we've noted a decrease in system flexibility over the last decade or so. Hydroelectric facilities are not as flexible as they used to be for a variety of reasons. Public safety, stewardship concerns, recreation, erosion, fish spawning, a number of other things. Mechanical, you've got older equipment that may not be as able to adjust their output as frequently as it did when the equipment was newer. And as a system operator, we frequently encounter what we call hydroelectric lockouts. A dispatch of a change in output for a hydroelectric facility and then being unable to move it again for a number of hours. We also see decreased flexibility on the system as we've increased the number of baseload facilities such as nuclear. Nuclear is a wonderful resource, has added emissions-free megawatts to the system. It is able to move, but it tends to operate as a baseload facility, and if you need flexibility to go ahead and increase output, well, it's already producing at its maximum output typically. In Ontario, we've also noted a change from coal to gas. Coal units were characterized by very low minimum loading points, which gave them a lot of room to maneuver. Natural gas facilities have higher minimum loading points. And in Ontario, when you've got increased amounts of baseload facilities over the last few years and decreases in demand for a variety of reasons, we actually see that we're getting our coal fleet on the line, our natural gas fleet on the line less than we used to get the coal facilities on the line. The picture is not all grim. We've added some flexibility back into the system. We added the ability to dispatch the variable generation facilities that are connected to the grid in 2013. And they are very fast-acting resources. At times, we have to reduce the output of these facilities to go ahead and manage congestion or surplus conditions. And once they are dispatched down, they are very quick to be quick and flexible to be dispatched back up. In 2016, we completed an operability study at the IESO that assessed the impact of increased quantities of variable generation. And we found that the accuracy of the variable generation forecast is very good within an hour. And the accuracy of the variable generation forecast is good, but not great, 1 hour out when you're scheduling imports and exports in and out of Ontario. 5 hours out, which is a typical time when we are committing our gas units. And 24 hours out when we schedule and commit resources day ahead. So on this graph below, in front of you, the forecast error is depicted here. The sharp and steep graph is the forecast error that we see within the hour. So the point of this slide is that within the hour, we've got much better information, which then feeds into our assessments of what resources we need to dispatch on the system. What's interesting in that, the information that we get 1 hour out, 5 hours out, 24 hours out isn't substantially different from each other. So bottom line is that we get much better information to go ahead and assess the resource fleet and what we need to do to balance the system within an hour. So given that we get much better information within the hour, we find, however, that there are limited Ontario resources available to respond to supply shortfalls if wind and solar production is less than we expect, or if electricity demand is greater than we expect. Just by way of extension, this issue is not unique to Ontario. System operators across the continent are dealing with the same thing. We all tend to have the same processes and in some instances, the same vendors that are providing us with our variable generation forecasts. And so our forecasts in Ontario are state-of-the-art, but they are not perfect. I'm going to quote from Richard Carlson's recent paper, Pricing Outcomes, a Framework for a 21st Century Electricity Market for Ontario, produced for Mowat Energy. The growth in generation from renewable electricity resources such as wind and solar creates a need for greater flexibility in the generation mix to ensure the reliability of the system. So as a consequence of our 2016 operability study, we assess that we need an additional about 840 megawatts of flexible resources in Ontario by the end of 2018. Again, coming back to my original statement of what does flexibility mean in Ontario. Flexibility is supply resources able to respond to IESO dispatch signals to increase their output within 30 minutes. This shortfall of flexible resources gets reflected in market results. In the first quarter of 2017, there were 37 events in Ontario where the hourly Ontario energy price exceeded $100 a megawatt hour. And in 1 hour in particular, hour 20 on March 11th, the price in Ontario reached $1,823 a megawatt hour. These price spikes reflect short-term supply-demand imbalances and a steep supply curve reflective of limited flexible resources available to address the imbalances. So what are we doing about it? So as a system operator, we need flexible resources today. When conditions exist for short-term supply-demand imbalances, and we expect there could be a reliability impact, as a system operator, we are bringing on resources with longer startup times that can then provide flexibility should there be an imbalance in real time where you need the flexibility to respond. In the short term, so beyond today, the IESO has started a flexibility stakeholder engagement in the middle of the year last year. That's the second bullet on this slide. So to meet flexibility needs in the short term, we need to incent greater flexibility from existing assets and participants and signal the need for and dispatch flexibility, that is, to get it online. In the longer term, we are looking to address flexibility as part of the market renewal program. One element of that is to examine the implementation of more frequent intertie scheduling. And we are going to take a look at the need for a flexibility product or mechanism. We need to make sure that anything that we provide is not only satisfying that need, but is also integrated with other market products that we are looking to introduce. And we also want to bring in lessons learned from other jurisdictions because they are grappling with the same issues and concerns that we have. That concludes my opening remarks. I'm going to turn it over to Rube Caraveau to go ahead and speak to his observations.
Sure. Thank you very much, Leonard. Oops. Just looking for my slide here. Oh, there it is. Fantastic. Okay. Yeah, so thanks. It's really a pleasure to be invited here and to join this group today. And I'm just blown away by the opening remarks and the keynote talk. I think there's so much exciting things going on right now, and I actually think maybe there's a lot in the signals, and there's not as much noise as everyone thinks. I think as long as these sorts of exercises of bringing people together, I think it cuts down the noise. So I'm from the University of Windsor Environmental Energy Institute and Turbulence Energy Lab, and I want to talk briefly about trying to help system flexibility through an education of the system side and the flexibility provider side through some what we call exergo-economic modeling, and I'll explain what that is. So I only have 2 slides. This is the first one. The questions that we're trying to answer is if you look at a system is interested in trying to understand as new technology emerges, what are these new assets that have the potential to come online? What are their capabilities? System will have certain requirements in terms of ramping, steady supply, black start, and so on. And these things, if you are not already grid connected, are unknowns. And so much of this storage landscape is still emerging. And even those that are grid connected are relatively embryonic in their sort of commercial life. So there's still a lot that's to be learned, and so the market and the system needs to sort of learn more about what's happening. And then once that has sort of been provided to the system, then the system can help really design market mechanisms that are going to benefit both the system and, of course, the operator or the storage asset provider. So on the energy storage asset side, and this is, you see HydroStore sign there in my figure, and it's one of the companies that we've been working with since they were a one-person company. They are now a grid-connected asset, and that happened in a relatively short time. They're on Toronto Island, operated with Hydrostore and Toronto Hydro. But even as their plant is up and grid-connected, there still remains a lot to be learned about its full capabilities. And so our job doing our modeling is to, and actual operational analysis of their facility, is to in detail characterize what happens as it goes through different potential operation modes. So efficiencies, and I'll speak a little bit more to this in the second slide, efficiencies change when you move away from a steady operating point. Many of us appreciate that already. But particularly for these new technologies, this is something that in many cases has been sort of sorted out maybe on paper or through design sketches or through models, but not necessarily in a grid-connected setup. And so that's something that has to be done. So you may have a 90%, or that's a bit unrealistic, but let's say 60% runtime efficiency at steady operation. But that might change sufficiently when you are trying to ramp up. And so if you have a really good idea of what your dynamic efficiency is as you move through different operating modes, then you are better positioned to assess the real opportunities for different market potential for you. Okay, and so those are sort of the questions we're trying to answer, is how best can these assets move to improve their business based on an enhanced knowledge of how their asset behaves under the very dynamic demands of a grid that's demanding flexibility. Okay, so this is just a symbolic schematic of an underwater compressed air energy storage facility like the one in Toronto, on Toronto Island. But this also could be very typical for a typical terrestrial compressed air energy storage facility. And the point I'm trying to make with the schematic is that many energy storage assets, and including electrochemical batteries, are a series of components. And each of these components will have their own efficiency points. And they work together in concert to make a system. And they'll each have their own efficiency curve. So when you marry all those together, you get a total round-trip efficiency, which is what most of us are interested in. But what a lot of us aren't aware of is that if you sort of break into the details and you look at the subsystem components and you address the efficiencies of how these components work together, there's opportunity to improve an overall efficiency. And that's what our modeling does. And that's what Exergo, the part of that word, the Exergo economic word, is really about sort of looking at a transient analysis of the efficiency of subcomponents of a total system to see which components have the opportunity to be improved and how they can be improved without necessarily changing the overarching design. So it's a matter of tuning or configuring. Of course, you can also change the design. But this helps really enhance the asset owner's knowledge of what's possible for their technology, and it really helps them understand how they could potentially capture market opportunities better. So if they find out that while operationally they can meet a certain ramp rate, but their overall efficiency in doing so is 20%, it might not make economic sense for them to perform that. And so we're trying to help, when we couple those exergy-based models with the market opportunity schedule, we're looking for an optimal path to provide the best business case for operators and the system to achieve success. So that's all I have, and I look forward to participating in the panel and addressing questions as they come. Thank you.
Thanks, Roo. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob.
Yeah, how you doing? I didn't prepare any slides. I'm really here to talk about the investments that have already been made in the industry here. So we've, over the last probably 10 years, even 25 years, we've invested a significant amount of money in natural gas facilities, and these facilities are a combination of non-utility generators and clean energy supply agreements with for natural gas facilities that are combined cycle. These resources have been already paid for. We've invested in them. The recent fair energy, fair hydro component is actually anticipated that the life of them will exceed the original contracts, and therefore they've added another 10 years to their lifespan. But these resources are currently being underutilized, and we believe that we can provide more flexibility to the system. But as in the current environment, the price signals aren't there. The investment to make those changes really isn't significantly available to us to make that decision. So if you look at real-time markets, so that 30-minute requirement, these facilities, a lot of them require anywhere from 2 hours to 12 hours to go from either a hot or a cold start to come online to provide that capabilities. And to Leonard's point earlier, the minimum load on these generators is significantly higher than they were with the coal generation. There are investments that can be made to one, shorten the time frame to bring those resources online, but also to reduce the minimum load. We'd have to work with suppliers and controls people to do that. But in the current environment, that investment signal isn't there. So would a flexibility market help a lot? Yes, but you'd have to see it there for a while, or you would have to look at bringing on contracts to provide that investment signal. As it currently sits, we've got about 7,000 megawatts of these resources that are probably being utilized at a capacity factor of something less than 5% right now. And they're the backbone of what's required on a day like today, but we can also provide 30-minute capability. It's just, there's some investment in kind of, as I said, control systems, capabilities. We would also have to maintain some of the natural gas facilities that we, transactions, or not so much transactions, but contracts we have to pull on the pipelines in a 30-minute time frame as well. So the investment isn't just in the resource themselves, but it's also in all of the upstream components to provide this capability. So we think that utilizing these resources as the investment that's already been made is a significant way of keeping costs down, maintaining the system in a reliable fashion, and providing the flexibility that's required. That's it for me.
Thanks, Rob. And last but not least, I'll turn it over to Christian.
Thank you very much. All right, I have a couple of slides here. There we go. So thank you for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. And not surprisingly, I think probably like many of you in the room, our view at ENERNOC is that market-based solutions are ultimately the best way to address some of these emerging challenges on the grid, particularly as it becomes more dynamic. And as we talk about market-based solutions, our view is also that you need to think not just about the supply side, but also about the demand side of the equation. And of course, our view is that demand response, in particular, can play a key role in helping balance what are increasingly dynamic grids and the need for more flexibility on those grids. So my comments today are really organized around two thoughts. First, to talk about the role that demand response can play in delivering more flexibility to our power grids. And then secondly, to speak about some of the barriers that exist today that result in less demand response participating in the market than may be possible in the future. As I talk about demand response, I really refer to both the load that can be managed on the grid to balance the grid, but also distributed technologies, distributed energy resources that are deployed behind the meter that can provide a balancing resource as part of a broader definition of demand response. What all these resources have in common, these distributed load and distributed technologies have in common, is that they are clean and in many cases very affordable ways to help balance the grid. So let me start by talking about the types of services that demand response can play. It really spans a spectrum of market use cases. We think of it across three broad product types. You have your grid insurance products. Typically, these are products that are dispatched anywhere from 0 to 6 times a year, depending on sort of emergency conditions on the grid. These are your traditional capacity demand response products, as well as some of your contingency products as well. You then move to more into the mainstream around contingency products. These are products that are can be dispatched up to 30 times a year and provide valuable balancing resources typically to a system. And then finally, you have your contingency products. And these are products that are typically constantly helping balance the grid and keep it within the expected or necessary operating parameters of the grid. So within these broad category types, we have our capacity products. Here in Ontario, we have a capacity demand response market that is dispatched with about a 4-hour lead time today, and we're looking at potentially shortening that. Other capacity-based demand response programs exist really across North America. PJM is probably the most well-known and in many ways the most mature, but the New England grid operator runs a capacity market that incorporates demand response. New York grid operator does. California, we have programs, and others. The contingency products, as I said before, span really your insurance category, but also the contingency category, and your response here is oftentimes much quicker. We have examples of these programs where demand response participates in Alberta with the LSSI program. In New Zealand, we have about 200 megawatts of load dropping off the grid in less than a second to help ensure grid stability. When the frequency falls, help restore that frequency. In Texas, there's a program called LR that it provides this service. In the eastern part of Australia, we have a similar program to New Zealand that's allowing load to participate from July of this year. Then we get into our non-spinning reserves products and our spinning reserves products. These are anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes of response, generally speaking, a little less as you get into spinning reserves. In Europe, they call these your tertiary and secondary reserves products. And then finally, you have your regulation products or your primary reserves products. And again, load is participating in many of these programs in Europe, these markets in Europe, and you see in North America primarily batteries participating behind the meter and grid scale batteries participating in these markets. And so the key point here is that demand response, both loads and distributed technologies behind the meter, can participate and deliver value across the whole spectrum of products that grids need to ensure reliability and balance and provide flexibility. What you see as you go from left to right, of course, is that your lead times decrease. Oftentimes your telemetry, your metering requirements increase. The complexity increases. Automation increases as you go left to right. And as a result, overall, the size of the opportunity from a load perspective does decrease. But even so, there's an opportunity for load to participate across all of these different categories. In Ontario, the demand response market is about 500 megawatts, and that represents about just over 1.5% of total system peak. In our view, there's an opportunity to grow that. In mature demand response markets, capacity markets, we see demand response participation generally between 5 and 10% of system peak. In PJM, as an example, today it's around 7% of system peak that's represented by demand response. So clearly there's a big opportunity to grow in Ontario. And not only does that deliver value from a reliability perspective, but it also provides a foundation for these loads to provide more flexible products to balance the needs that you're seeing emerge on the grid. The key here is that capacity products are, because they're the most simple, are often a gateway for the demand side to begin to participate in providing these types of services to the grid. They give businesses an opportunity to start to understand the flexibility that they might be able to manage behind the meter to provide value to the grid. They also provide certainty around return on investment because of the nature of capacity markets. The fact that loads that participate have some assurance that they will earn a return on the investment for spending time understanding the market opportunities, for investing in metering and telemetry to support their activities in these markets. And so from our perspective, capacity programs are the gateway, are the foundation on which load can then provide more value to the grid, more flexible resources. And so what we look for is the opportunity to grow demand response through capacity markets on the left, and then engage a subset of those loads that can do this technically and commercially across the products that we see as we move right across the screen here. And in our view, that's the opportunity here on Ontario. The opportunity is to grow the capacity demand response market, but then to engage a subset of those customers, those businesses that are participating in those capacity programs to provide more flexible resources, and in particular resources that can respond in a 30-minute time frame. To make that happen in Ontario, there are two barriers in particular that need to be addressed. The first relates to aggregation, and the second is related to telemetry requirements. So in Ontario today, we have probably 4 to 8 large loads that provide a 30-minute flexibility product as part of the operating reserves markets in Ontario. These are large loads that directly participate in the market, and that proves that load can provide these balancing resources in the market. But in order to grow the participation from load, in our experience doing this in other markets around the world, allowing aggregation is critical. That is allowing third parties to work as partners to commercial industrial businesses that are looking to participate in these markets and help take what oftentimes appears to businesses focused on producing products or managing facilities, take what's quite complex and really make it easy for them to participate. And also to de-risk their participation by aggregating loads together and building resources that together can deliver a very reliable resource to the grid, while mitigating some of the risks that you'll have at a site-by-site basis with these types of products. So aggregation is critical to growing the participation of load and distributed resources in these flexibility products, these 30-minute operating reserves types of products. Today, Ontario doesn't allow aggregation for these products, these flexible products, and so the first barrier that needs to be addressed simply is allowing aggregators to participate. And that would be in keeping with how other markets around the world have encouraged load to participate in these markets. You see some examples of other markets that allow aggregated load to participate in operating reserves programs listed. The second relates to telemetry. And again, this is related to the monitoring, how we monitor and measure the performance of these assets on the grid providing these services. Connecting to a single plant or perhaps a few large loads is pretty straightforward. But when we talk about aggregating loads to deliver these services, we're oftentimes talking about hundreds or maybe thousands of different assets, different loads that are participating. And collecting data instantaneously, which is the current requirement in Ontario to deliver the service, to monitor that service, can be technically demanding, obviously, and also cost prohibitive potentially. And so what we see in other markets is the need to understand exactly what the grid needs to get comfortable that this aggregated resource can deliver reliably for the grid, and then to think thoughtfully about the types of requirements that are necessary to allow that activity to happen in a way that makes commercial and technical sense for hundreds and maybe thousands of sites that are providing these services. And so you see here as well examples of different markets, how they've approached this. You see markets like the synchronized reserve market in PJM, the interruptible load program in New Zealand, that require very granular data, less than a second or maybe a minute, but don't require it in real time necessarily. You see other examples in Alberta and New England where the data is required in real time, but in some cases it's only required at an aggregated level, which makes it a lot more cost effective and at the same time being as useful as being useful for the grid operator. So these are the two key areas that we think need consideration as we look at how can these loads, the demand side, deliver more value to the grid from a flexibility perspective. And so in summary here, the key points in order to maximize the value of the demand side with these flexibility products is around aggregation for non-dispatchable as well as dispatchable loads, adapting telemetry requirements to accommodate aggregation while meeting the grid's needs, the grid operator's needs. And then there's some other key principles here as well that perhaps we can speak more about as part of the Q&A. But obviously the need to allow dual participation across the different products that are highlighted that are available to the demand side so they can optimize across the capacity market and these flexibility products. Ensure ramp rate requirements make sense for loads that may respond in different ways than a binary plant, for example. allow for flexibility of offers, including the ability to change megawatt offers hourly in line with market requirements. And finally, being technology agnostic is critical so that we can allow different types of loads to participate and different types of behind-the-meter technologies to participate. So I'll leave it there and look forward to responding to questions as part of the Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Christian. With that, we will open it up to the floor for questions. Go ahead.
Jen Hiscock, Natural Resources Canada again. Can I just get a point of clarification? Because I thought there was 12 megawatts of aggregated residential load in the last demand response auction by the IESO.
Sorry, you thought there were 12 megawatts of aggregated residential load?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That may well be. So my understanding is that in total there are 500 megawatts of demand response. And it would make sense to me, although I don't know this for certain, that 12 megawatts that could be residential and the balance would be commercial industrial, running the gamut from smaller businesses that may be contributing 100 kilowatts to large loads that may be contributing multiple megawatts. Yeah.
And to pick up on that point, you are correct. There is aggregated residential load, but the demand response product has different time scales for dispatch than our 5-minute dispatch. So the type of things that we're looking at here for flexibility are things that are dispatchable on a 5-minute basis, and this demand response product that you allude to, these resources, are dispatchable on an hourly basis with an amount of hours of notice in advance. Go ahead.
Jack Gibbons, Ontario Clean Air Alliance. I have a question I'm hoping the panel members can address. Would closing the inflexible Pickering nuclear station in 2018, would that help us create a more a flexible grid in Ontario?
That's a fairly good question. I guess one of the things that we'll do is we'll reduce surplus baseload generation, so we will reduce the baseload generation that we have, which will require more, create space for more of the natural gas facilities, which will be able to provide the flexibility requirement. But generally speaking, we're already in a situation where during the spring and the fall, we're talking about the price spikes. We're curtailing 1,000 megawatts of water, we're curtailing 1,000 megawatts of wind or more at different time frames. So I'm not sure necessarily that closing Pickering is going to alleviate those spring and fall problems that we're seeing from a flexibility standpoint. It will help during different time frames, but I'm not sure necessarily there.
Len, just to add to Rob's points, you have a number of facilities that, whether it's Pickering or whether it's an import from Quebec, say, they're fixed for the hour with limited ability to go ahead and move. And so we're looking at additional resources that can move within the hour. As it stands right now, we have an insufficient quantity. Sorry, just lost my point. Those resources that are inflexible within those periods of time don't allow us to go ahead and respond. So regardless of whether it's a nuclear facility or or an import or things that are inflexible within the hour, that becomes a challenge for us. What we did find is that in analysis of price spikes earlier this year, if you don't have Pickering or if you don't have an import, one could argue that you're going to have more gas online. What we find is that because we go ahead and commit resources efficiently, that we use those resources effectively, there's not a lot of headroom on those gas resources that we bring on to meet demand in place of other resources. So we found that we had price spikes earlier this year, regardless of whether we had 1 gas unit online or 10 gas units online. Paul?
Paul Accioni from the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers. We've been noticing here in Ontario, and it's starting to happen elsewhere in the world now, that as you clean up the grid, you start to curtail off more and more the clean generation. Eventually, when it's 100% clean, it'll all be, fair bit will be curtailed. I'd be interested in hearing the panel's views on the benefits in Ontario and other places if we introduced an interruptible retail electricity market so that consumers can get the low-cost surplus clean power to displace fossil fuels and other applications, or to incent behind-the-meter storage so that we can reduce our peak capacity requirements. I don't know, maybe Len, you can start, and the other panels can offer your comments on whether an interruptible retail electricity market would be beneficial.
So I'll actually come at it from a slightly different perspective. Right now we have a number of market mechanisms in Ontario. A 5-minute energy price, operating reserve markets, DR auction. And the market renewal program is looking to go ahead and enhance those market mechanisms. And so they're starting the initial stages of identifying the objectives that they're looking for in the market, or the types of market responses. So what you're speaking to is a specific type of solution that I would hope would be part of the conversations to say, what are the objectives around market renewal? What are we looking to achieve? What are the different mechanisms to do that? One of with regard to flexibility in particular, it's something that all market operators across North America are grappling with. Do you go ahead and provide a ramp product? Do you go ahead and expand the operating reserve market as a way to incent flexibility? Do you go ahead and do it through a capacity mechanism? So I think what you're speaking to is one methodology or one application of a solution that I would hope that our market renewal discussions would explore as part of the things that they're looking at. Anybody else from the panel?
The only thing I would add to that is sort of a broad statement that the more price signals, the more market-based price signals we can send to energy consumers, especially larger energy consumers who may have some flexibility, the better. I think that, for organizations that, have meaningful energy costs and are looking for ways to manage that, if we can help them understand what's driving the cost of the system and make those price signals apparent, then they will look for ways and look for partners who can help them figure out how to respond to that. So if a retail interruptible product is probably one way to do that, there are other ways as well. You allude to some of them, and I think in general we want to be sending those price signals to the through market mechanisms so that the load side can respond.
If we could go to the back microphone.
Great, thank you. My name is Mike Fletcher. I work for the City of Ottawa in planning and energy management. I think I'm going to follow on Paul's points a little bit. It's after 10 o'clock, and nobody has said the global adjustment yet. So it's time to get that elephant in the room. I don't think even Trump's son could kill that elephant. I find it really surprising to have a discussion about market flexibility and not bring up GA. I think Class B for global adjustment is the greatest source of market inflexibility we have in the province. And I'll give you an example. City of Ottawa has 5 long-term care facilities that have electric boilers. They've got electric boilers for redundancy. As it stands, the boilers are brought online once a month for a test. I go online every day, wistfully look at the hourly electricity price, note that at those 5 facilities, it often could be providing thermal at less than the cost of natural gas. And also note, once again, because of GA, the whole concept of accessing that, which we could easily do, we have the controls, is completely out of the question. So, that's why when I come to a meeting like this and I start hearing about the latest things in storage, I zone out a little bit. The thermal market in Ontario peaks at 84 gigawatts. That's almost 4 times the peak of the electrical market. Start thinking about the way those two need to interact. And if we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and want to start doing it further than the electricity market, let's look at ways of of using these periods of surplus to take over jobs in other areas, for example, thermal. So I know that's not a question, just a statement, but I thought it'd be a good thing to get out there reasonably early in the discussions today. Thank you.
I think it's a great point, and it's further, to the point of sending, allowing more of the load side maybe to see those price signals and offer the flexibility they have inherent, in their operations back to the grid to provide these flexibility products. So I agree.
And just following on Christian's point, I think you raise an interesting point that a number of system and market operators are grappling with, and that is, as we move to a cleaner grid, you're ending up with increasing amounts of time where your marginal price is being set by low emissions resources, low fuel cost resources like wind, like solar, like hydroelectric, like nuclear, that have low marginal cost. Therefore, your energy prices are going to be low, which means that in order to provide the right revenues, your capacity costs, your capacity charges are higher, and that's reflected in the GA. That's something that all market and system operators across North America are grappling with.
Thank you.
Yeah, Philip Andres, Next Hydrogen Corporation. Again, picking up on the theme of seasonal imbalances, it seems to me if we want to derive full value from renewables and actually decarbonize the entire economy, we would have to take advantage of those seasonal imbalances and utilize them. And the only way to do that is really through long-term storage, and power to gas really is the vehicle to do that via electrolysis, producing hydrogen. And we've submitted a report to you guys, actually, to the IESO, that shows that we could integrate 1,000 megawatts of electrolyzers and run them at over 50% capacity factor in Ontario, and greatly benefit the system, and at the same time decarbonize the transportation sector. So basically we're producing a useful gas that then can decarbonize steam methane reformed hydrogen, or replace that, or be used and stored in depleted natural gas wells. So just thought I bring that up because it definitely can address a lot of the issues that we have, and prevent exporting power at a loss to neighboring jurisdictions.
Okay, well, power to gas is an interesting energy storage. I use the word energy rather than electricity, because you're correct. Electrolyzers go ahead and split that into carbon and hydrogen, when you can go ahead and burn the hydrogen, next day, next month, next year, if you so choose. A power to gas facility doesn't necessarily increase the amount of capacity in Ontario, because you've got a fixed set of natural gas generation facilities. And so you could go ahead and run the electrolyzers at this point in time, and then use it in the middle of July. But it doesn't increase the amount of natural gas capacity.
The hydrogen can be used in the gas pipeline system for anything. I mean, you can basically run gas-fired generation and run it on a decarbonized, basically, gas mix, right? So it's available to you for transportation, for space heating, and for power generation, really, for all those things. And you can also utilize it for addressing forecasting errors. You can use it short-term as well. So it doesn't restrict you just only from using it for seasonal imbalances. So you can use it, in essence, for the whole slate of products you're looking for, short-term, medium, and long-term.
Yeah, excellent point. Again, the key point is energy storage, because as you say, it can be used for a variety of different applications. Paul?
Paul Accioni again. Len, you said something that was quite important a few minutes ago, and I don't know if we all heard it. You said that a clean system is fundamentally a fixed cost system with very low marginal costs, essentially zero fuel cost. Why aren't we charging the GA in terms of peak kilowatts consumed during the month instead of kilowatt hours? Because then the retail market would work. Except for the regulatory charges, which are in kilowatt hours. But they can be changed too.
Good question. I'm going to defer to the market renewal program. That's probably a better forum to go ahead and consider that within the broad context of the number of different ways that you can design both capacity and energy charges within Ontario. Seeing nobody else at the mic, I'm going to engage Roop in a question. So following up on your themes, which were barriers for storage facilities, are in understanding the technical requirements, the ability to respond to dispatch, the ability to understand the technical cycle efficiencies, and also from a business model standpoint, both for providing a variety of energy services. In your opinion, do you think that some of these storage technologies are ready for prime time production now, or would you say that perhaps a better path is to take a look at pilots to go ahead and explore this further? As you know, we've had a number of different storage pilots. Do you think we're at the cusp yet, or do you think that we still need to learn a little bit more?
It's a great question, Leonard. In my experience, all the modeling in the world is fantastic, and you can get a lot from it. But until you get to the pilot stage and start collecting real data and see how the inertia of some of these machines and these electronics behave, you don't have a lot of confidence in predicting the real-world performance, and particularly as you try to eke out the margins of greatest efficiency for these systems. I mean, let's be frank about it. Energy storage is not a bolt-on solution. It's a systems approach if it's done properly. And that's what the panel's been speaking to. It's not about cooking up something new and connecting it to the grid. It's looking at the grid as a whole and seeing what storage really means. And in some cases, that is bringing in new technology. In other cases, it's utilizing what we already have. But I think we're close. But I do think that if there's resource for more pilots, I would certainly be in support of that, just because I've seen what tremendous experience can be sort of availed with the pilots, and it really builds confidence for moving ahead.
Great, thank you. Rob, I'm going to throw one your way.
Sure.
So we both talked about similar sides or different sides of a similar observation. So when I spoke earlier, I mentioned that we've had a number of different price spikes. And in my economics 101 experience, price spikes should be driving some amount of behavior. Yet when you talked about barriers, you were talking about significant investments, both on from a technical capability standpoint to go ahead and convert existing facilities. And you also talked about the infrastructure, the additional infrastructure things that you need to do to go ahead and bring on things like more flexible gas arrangements. So I guess my question in the end is, are the market signals, the price spikes, are they sufficient to go ahead and drive certain behavior? And if not, why not?
I think right now what we're seeing is we've seen some temporary price spikes over the last couple of years. But if we go back 3 or 4 years, when these facilities were all running at 30-40% capacity factor, the price spikes were a lot less. And as we move forward, and we've brought on other resources, and the conservation has reduced the load, and as a result of that, what we're seeing is there's reduced flexibility in the marketplace is showing up as OR prices. So we're seeing higher OR prices. We're seeing opportunities there, and as a result of that kind of really short-term shortage, you're getting the $100 price spikes as a result of not having the flexible resources. Those price signals aren't consistent or strong enough yet for us to go and make an investment for a 3 or 5 year return. You need to see something a lot more solid than that. That's not going to make you go out and spend up to $10 million or $5 million on control systems upgrades or whatever the incremental cost is. These resources, or even another way of looking at it, is that these resources have a lifespan, and we're not utilizing them to the best of their capability right now. We could potentially take some of the wear and tear right now, kind of run them really hard and run them outside of their normal operation. A lot of the resources were built as intended to be baseload facilities, recycling them more than they were intended to, recycling them a lot more than they were intending them to. And as a result of that, the investment could be made to actually, if the price signals were there, we had the capability to come online within 30 minutes or within an hour, and we could kind of eat some of the life up now, recognizing that they're not going to be around for 40 years like the coal units were. So, kind of short, it's just not enough signals present, and there's too much risk going forward that the government's going to do another Hydro-Quebec deal, or this is going to happen, or what's the investment going to be into the future, that there's no guarantee that these price signals are going to last any longer than they have. And until you get that, you're really not going to get the investment.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, I have a question for Christian. So having been involved in the growth of, or the growth in demand response as a concept, we opened the market in 2002 with dispatchable loads. And then as system operators, it's been difficult to get past the notion of I can see the iron in the ground for a supply resource, and demand resource is something that has been taking a little while to build up the trust that that resource is there. And I think it was reflected in the two barriers that you talked about, the absence of telemetry and the challenges of aggregation, not knowing where that resource is going to be physically connected to the system. So over time, market and system operators have slowly evolved their thinking to gain that trust. What, in your view, what additional things might we need to do to go ahead and help build that trust that that resource is there when we want it and need it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it does get to the point around telemetry. I think, understandably, a lot of the grid operators around the world are still very much interested to see, or they have more confidence and see on the ground than this nebulous resource that's going to show up or in literal sense actually come off the grid. The reality is when you look at the performance of demand response as an aggregated resource, it actually outperforms conventional generation in most markets. And that's due to the fact that with aggregated demand response, you're combining literally thousands of resources together to deliver on an obligation that you've agreed with the grid operator. And while within that aggregation, you're going to have loads that can't maybe give their full commitment each time, others will be able to give more, and we can deliver reliable performance time and time again through that aggregation. That compares to, a great example is the polar vortex in late 13, I believe it was, or 14, January 14, I believe it was, in across North America, but in PJM in particular, demand response showed up much stronger in the middle of winter when it was only voluntary, it wasn't even required to be available, than generation plant. Because, again, you had a few plants that weren't able to start due to the weather conditions and other factors. And while you certainly had a few loads that couldn't participate in aggregate, you have a responsive resource. So, the data is there already to suggest that it's very reliable. In terms of how you get the grid operators comfortable with that, that is where the telemetry becomes important, I think. And that gets down to providing the visibility that the grid operators need to say, this is what's available on the system right now. If I call it, this is what I'm going to get. And when I call it, here's how I can, I can see it. I can see the load coming off the grid. So that technology exists, that capability exists. In markets we're collecting, in some markets we're collecting sub-second data to prove to grid operators that the load is coming off as it's required. In other markets we're collecting it, at minute or 5 minute intervals, providing it in real time. Sometimes we provide it at the site level, so we'll have 1,000 data streams coming in every second. In other cases, we can aggregate that at the portfolio and say, here's how this resource is performing together. Obviously, our view is that we need to give the grid operators enough comfort that it's delivering what they expect, but we prefer not to over-engineer it if we can help it. So the aggregated view in most cases we think is sufficient, and then we manage the risk within the portfolio. So I think that, the data is there, and by working together to find sort of the needs of the grid operator and get clarity as to what they want to see to get comfortable with it, we can do that, and that's been done in different ways in different markets over the years.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to thank my fellow panelists, Rob, Roop, and Christian. I'd like to thank you for your questions. With that, I'm going to wrap up this panel and inform you that we are looking to reconvene at 10:45. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We're going to get back and we're going to resume our agenda now. So for everyone who's sitting down in here, I want to thank you. You heard my call earlier to partner with me to help to keep the event on time. So that's much appreciated, and I know we'll continue to do that throughout the day. So I'm thanking you in advance on that too. So this next panel discussion is going to focus on the influence of decarbonization on electricity markets. And we have quite a good panel here who I'm pleased to introduce right now. The panel is moderated by Adam White, who as president and CEO of Power Consumer is really focused on designing and building new tools for his clients to engage with customers in new ways and unlocking new opportunities. Adam's joined by Jack Burkham, who's the Senior Vice President of Commercial Development for Brookfield. Jack leads his front office team to optimize revenues from their fleet of electric generating stations across North America. Also on the panel is Peter Fuller, the Senior Vice President of Market and Regulatory Affairs for NRG. In addition to his work there, Peter served as Vice Chair of the Independent Power Producers of New York and as State Chair of the Solar Industries Association for New York. And then completing the panel is Kathleen Spies, a principal at the Brattle Group. Kathleen, who has worked with market operators, transmission system operators, and regulators in more than a dozen jurisdictions globally on their market designs. So with that, Adam, please take it away.
Thank you, Rob. I'm just going to introduce for a couple of minutes, and each one of the panelists is going to give you their presentation to bring the perspective from markets elsewhere, to bring some particular perspective from the U.S., and Jack will bat cleanup in terms of some specifics. All I wanted to do really with you before then is to provide a little bit of context to contextualize what we're talking about, because we're talking about energy policy and decarbonization, and to the extent that electricity market design is the impetus for decarbonization, or carbon market design is the impetus for decarbonization, I think that we can agree that carbon and energy are two sides of the same coin in our modern economy, and we have to manage them together. The other part of the context that we talked about on the phone when we were preparing for today's panel was the political one, because in Ontario, of course, the Crown owns most of the assets and has a very deep stake in energy policy, as it were, in particular the government of the day of Premier Kathleen Wynne. It's less than a year from now, we'll have the next general election in Ontario, and that by that point, the Ontario Liberal Party of Canada will have formed the government in Ontario almost for 15 years. I think it'll be 14 years and 8 months if the election happens as prescribed in the legislation on June 7th, 2018. Now, energy policy, interestingly enough, is one of those albatross files for premiers and energy ministers. Energy ministers change so quickly that they don't often bear any permanent scars, but premiers have to wear the decisions they make during their term. And but at every important political juncture over the last 14 years, when the Ontario Liberal Party has faced re-election, they have recommitted themselves to the core values of their energy policy and their environment policy and their social policy, and they have won. That's why they're still in power. And they're coming to an election again, and I think this opportunity, I use a device with my students at U of T and clients to emphasize the importance of key messages. And so, you know, the key message scenario is that you go to Queen's Park, you go into the elevator, and just as the door is closing, the Premier steps in and the doors close. And the Premier turns to you, "Hey, Adam, how's it going?" I don't know the Premier, we've never met, but I imagine that it's my story, so I imagine that. And so I have an opportunity as the elevator goes up 3 floors in the legislative building to, you know, say to the Premier what I should say to her about what the Premier should do going into the next election to leverage the investments that Ontarians have been asked to make, that we're all committed to contractually for a long time, and how she can leverage the institutions that we have, the infrastructure that we have, the knowledge and expertise we have, the strength and diversity of the growing energy services ecosystem that we have as represented in this fantastic audience today. And I keep thinking about all of the things I should say to the Premier if I had the opportunity, and all I can think to say is, Premier, make Ontario great. So I'm going to hand it over to Catherine, and she's going to give us the lowdown.
Right. Thanks so much. Let's see if mine slides are up. So my task on the panel was to help frame up this question. You know, basically, what is the question we're talking about when we, in this panel, of the choice that Ontario has in front of it in terms of, you know, decarbonization in the electricity market. What does that really look like, and what are the paths forward? As mentioned in the introduction, I've worked with market operators around the world in at least a dozen different jurisdictions, and all of them are really addressing the same question, but it's manifesting in a lot of different ways. I think what's interesting in Ontario that I've kind of realized working here over the past little bit, especially deeply with many of you in the benefits case for market renewal. So Ontario, in some ways, is so far ahead of the rest of the world, having done 80% decarbonization in a decade. That's just an incredible change to the whole system. The realization of these very big, very ambitious policy objectives. But I think you probably can't be too surprised that what we found out of the benefits case, the market design is actually quite far behind. The market renewal is looking at revamping and modernizing the energy market, looking at the flexibility needs, which we heard earlier this morning, looking at a capacity market to do a market-based approach to attracting the investments needed for resource adequacy. And then in a separate process, you've just implemented cap and trade, so a very good design for market-based valuation of carbon. But there's still a lot of folks in the room and a lot of folks that I've talked to who are very concerned that there's a big missing piece to the market renewal that hasn't quite been addressed. And one way or another, the question is, does the electricity market need to express an additional clean energy or carbon mandate as part of the market design? And that would be on top of cap and trade. So I think, throughout this brief set of introductory remarks, I wanted to really address that question specifically. So first, again, another thing that you all know well, but that is a very fundamental part of this discussion. What does it mean to have a 80% decarbonized system? So here we're just looking at the total customer cost in this chart. Going back a decade, the large majority of customer costs came from the energy market. Basically reflective of the fact that as a fossil-based system, most of the system costs were fuel cost, and that translates to the energy part of the customer bill. And global adjustment was, a pretty small residual component on top. But over the last decade, with decarbonization and with lower gas prices, together those two things have really flipped the equation in a very big way. So now global adjustment is 70+% of the customer bill. That really reflects the change in a system, as again mentioned by someone earlier today. The change from a system where most of the costs were variable or fuel cost to a system where more decarbonized, most of the costs are investment costs. So embedded in that, global adjustment, there's capacity value, there's the clean value, the value that Ontario places on decarbonization, and other policy objectives that have been embedded in these contracts that have been signed over time. And then the lower part, is the lower energy prices and the energy component of the bill. We expect that to be the same or continue going forward. So, what does that, what does that mean when you're moving to a market? Trying to transition to more market-based approaches. How does that system of costs translate into a market structure? So that's the question that I'm trying to look at in this figure here. On the left, you see the same thing here, the global adjustment as more than 70% of the bill, and then the rest is the energy part of the bill. So now that we have cap and trade and the ideas for market renewal, how do those cost components translate to the markets that have been defined or proposed, because they haven't been implemented yet with market renewal. So energy, it's really going to be about the same part of the bill, but it will be lower, I expect, because you're going to get efficiency gains from more efficient energy and ancillary service markets and flexibility products. So that part will shrink, but again, it'll be a similar order of magnitude. Capacity auction, the next red piece, that's about the size that you'd expect the capacity market to fill. That's really the expression of the resource adequacy objective, the need to meet system peak. Some of that will go to fossil plants. As they come off of contract, they will be paid through capacity market prices. And we'll get some efficiency savings there because we expect the capacity market to basically have more efficient outcomes than the former contracting approaches. So we do expect some cost savings there. And then the clean energy resources will also have capacity value. So you have that kind of two-part there, but either way, those together stack up to the capacity value that'll be embedded in the bill. And then on top of that, you have cap and trade. So this is the approximate size of the cap and trade market relevant to the electricity sector. You'll notice it's quite small. So at $18 a ton, which is the price floor, that's really the size of the carbon abatement value. That'll translate into something like $9 a megawatt hour in energy price. So that's the value that will be also expressed and realized by clean energy resources. So that carbon value is, decarbonization value already is part of the suite of market services that's on the table for Ontario as it stands. That being said, it's $9 a megawatt hour approximately, at least at the earliest carbon prices that we've seen. And if you are someone who has done investments in clean energy resources, you'll notice that that's really not enough of a value thesis to invest in most clean energy resources going forward. In some cases, it may not be enough to reinvest in existing clean energy resources once their contracts roll off. So that's where we've heard folks talking about, well, do we need another piece? Do we need another market mechanism? Do we need something else in the electricity sector? And that's this big question mark box. And so that's basically the question that I think we're going to pose in this panel. Is there another value stream that should be in the market, in the electricity market specifically, as part of this whole suite of market services in Ontario? So answering that question, in my mind, there are really kind of three paths forward toward answering that question. First is, is that, no, there's not another bucket. There's not another market that we're talking about. In that case, we're really relying on the cap and trade market, which is the economy-wide expression of carbon objectives and the value of abating carbon. And that's all that would be needed or used in the electricity sector. And what does that mean? What are the implications of that path? What it means is potentially the electricity sector can recarbonize a bit. We'd expect carbon emissions from the sector over time to go up, especially during nuclear refurbishments when you have large quantities of clean energy going offline for refurbishment, we do expect that's going to be replaced by fossil-emitting plants, absent some other intervention. But you know, there's definitely a view that some might take that this is economically efficient. So if you have a province-wide objective for decarbonization, and you have that carbon trajectory and that path, and it's reflected in economy-wide cap and trade, maybe the least cost solution for the whole province is to achieve more carbon reductions from other sectors and allow the electricity sector to increase emissions up to a point. Now, if Ontario is going to go that route, I think it's very important to acknowledge that that is a likely outcome, that some emissions increases from the electricity sector should be expected, and that's something that policymakers would need to acknowledge and accept if that's the approach going forward. The middle option is what I've heard some people advocate for or think of as the only option, which is to keep doing what Ontario has been doing and do supply contracting for clean energy resources. So to the extent that the market-based revenues themselves are not sufficient to retain existing clean energy or attract new clean energy going forward, then the province could do that. Now, I find this path to be a problematic path, because you're trying to mix the market-based approach with, you know, this contracting approach. And that can lead to a lot of conflict, a lot of regulatory uncertainty, a lot of interactions that, you know, can have adverse impacts on the investment thesis for in-market resources, because you have this uncertainty and regulatory issues on the out-of-market. And we've also seen you know, that there's a strong appetite to go for more market-based mechanisms, to really rely on market-based incentives and structures to achieve those policy objectives. So I do think it would be a shame to, you know, basically take a step backward on that and, you know, use these out-of-market mechanisms. And then the third path, if Ontario does decide that the electricity sector needs to do more for decarbonization or stay decarbonized at current levels, there is an opportunity to do that in market. So this is something that is definitely possible, but it does need to be understood as a significant effort, you know, to design such a market. And, you know, the two main ways that you could do that are either putting in more enhanced carbon pricing in the electricity sector, which would essentially mean that we're paying more for carbon abatement in the electricity sector compared to other sectors. And you know, that from an economy-wide perspective isn't going to be the least cost, but that is the most direct way to value carbon. And the other option would be doing some sort of a clean energy market. So a market where you know, the same as energy values energy, capacity market values reliability and resource adequacy. The clean energy market would be a value stream valuing clean resources. So I see those as the three main options going forward. Wrap up my comments here. I think that the policy direction to move toward resource-neutral market-based mechanisms is a positive approach. I know that there's a big need to contain customer costs and achieve these efficiency benefits. I think that's you know, a good path forward for the province. And so the first question that I think should be asked is there a special carbon objective in the electricity sector that's above and beyond the other sectors? So that's the first question. Does anything need to be done, or is cap and trade enough? Again, acknowledging that the electricity sector might increase emissions in that case. If not, I think that it would be a very good idea to look at one of these market-based mechanisms moving forward. That's it.
Good morning. Good morning. And I want to thank Adam and Ryan at the IESO and everyone for giving me the opportunity to come here today. It's been a while since I've been in Ontario, back in the early days of markets. Actually, Adam and I and a few others in the room worked together, and I'm surprised how many years have passed since that time. So what I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about a postcard from America. I know certainly from the work that I generally do in the Northeast RTO regions in the U.S. primarily, but also across the U.S., I have a bit of a set of blinders with respect to what happens north of the border. So I'm assuming that perhaps some of you have some of those same blinders. So part of what I want to do is to tell you a little bit about what's going on, where there are parallels to the kind of challenges that I'm understanding here in Ontario, and also some of the things that you may be able to learn from the U.S. markets, mistakes to avoid, things to potentially emulate, and so forth, and also offer a few thoughts about, with my couple of decades here in market redesign, market design, and the economics of it, and the politics of it, maybe some thoughts for how market renewal broadly writ could move forward and provide great benefit to the province. So. First, just for those of you who may not be so familiar with NRG, I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but we are one of the largest independent power producers in the U.S. We've got facilities across the fuel spectrum, from nuclear to coal to oil, gas, a great fleet of renewables. So we're all over the fuel space, and we're actively committed to the turnover and the decarbonization that you've seen here, and that really is the central part of the conversation, apparently everywhere other than the U.S. White House. But we're really committed to the renewable future, storage, demand response, really integrating a system that's far more sophisticated and advanced and clean than the system that we all grew up with in the 20th century and lived with for so many years. A little bit closer to home, you may know NRG Curtailment Solutions as a demand response provider here in the province. We also have a substantial business, our biggest footprint, of course, in PJM, one of the biggest markets in the U.S., also a substantial footprint in New York, New England, Texas, and California, the other places with sort of vibrant demand side and market structures overall. Each has its own pros and cons, pluses and minuses, but there are certainly opportunities for demand response and some of that more innovative thinking that I was talking about. So with that as background, what we're wrestling with in the U.S. is, I think Kathleen referred to this, where Ontario is far ahead, or perhaps Adam, is far ahead in terms of decarbonization, but is really behind in terms of structuring markets and third-party private investment to make these things happen. And so it's a little bit different. It's a bit reversed in the U.S. that the markets, while none of them are perfect or fully formed, they really have come a long way in the last couple of decades. And I would argue, particularly in the Northeast, where you've got forward capacity markets and a lot of other improvements in New England and PJM in particular, and to some extent New York, those are working quite well to draw in investment in power plants in adequacy and reliability, which is what the markets were designed for. Texas likewise has a very vibrant energy-only market that, defying all expectations, is actually producing a fair amount of investment, some driven by state and federal policy on renewables, but other investment actually driven by private investors seeing some opportunity there. So just to give you a quick rundown of these areas, California is perhaps among the most aggressive in terms of renewable energy and decarbonization. Seeing a lot of move there. So you're probably familiar with the duck curve or some variant on it that may be occurring here, where you're seeing high solar output in the middle of the day. What used to be the peak times of the summer afternoons is no longer a peak. It's actually a very low load time. So we've kind of turned the system on its head, and California is wrestling with that. California has a, not dissimilar to Ontario, I think, a contract-based investment model or a resource adequacy model. They look to the utilities in particular, but really as with state authorization to produce the next round of investment or to keep current investment in place. And that's sort of set up the situation there. Moving around the bottom, Texas went to this energy-only market, and it's been very aggressive on that. We've done some work lately, the paper that I'd be happy to refer you to, that really looks at some of the details and the fine points of what it means to be an energy-only market, and why Texas may be falling short in some regards because of some little details that were left out of their original implementation. But a lot of renewable capacity there based on the wind, the federal production tax credits, and again, you're seeing a lot of negative and low prices at times that you never would have expected it, and a lot of variability. Moving back up to the top, New York is particularly active in moving to the grid edge or out into the distribution system with their reforming the energy vision proceeding, which is a massive proceeding, and I think really ambitious. Yet to be seen whether the ambition can be realized, but a very ambitious idea to really reshape the way utility regulation is done, the way utilities are incentivized, the way investment happens, and the way the system operates by pushing more and more control and resources out into the distribution system to customer sites or near customer sites. So a really huge thing. And at the same time, New York has very ambitious renewable energy and carbon reduction goals. They've also implemented very recently a controversial program to pay an additional fee to certain upstate nuclear units that had threatened that the markets as they existed with low gas prices, low energy prices, increasing renewables, were not supporting those nuclear units. New York felt compelled to put an additional charge in place to pay them. So that's an ongoing controversy in the US about how to get markets to behave in the face of state actions like that. New England has a parallel but somewhat different issue going on with new renewables. The states, in particular the southern New England states, are very ambitious in terms of carbon goals and renewable energy, and are seeking to contract for large amounts of renewable energy and capacity. What is that going to do to markets? So that's created a very active stakeholder discussion. We have a very, we can talk governance at some point, but we have a very real small d democratic structure in most of these markets for how rules get vetted and implemented. Likewise, PJM, the biggest New England, Northeast market, facing some of the same issues. States have certain resources that they favor. These happen to be nuclear or coal, legacy assets, existing assets, as opposed to the new assets in New England. But again, looking to provide them with extra payments outside the market. How do we get that to all work? And FERC, the federal regulator in the U.S. that oversees the market activities in these regions, other than Texas, is actively working on a proceeding to ask, to look at this question. If states do things, how do they influence markets? The markets are the purview of FERC. How do the federal and state regulatory issues work together? So a lot going on that I think bears pretty closely in some of the trends here in Ontario, and really is getting at some of the same underlying drivers. Decarbonization, clean energy, and making sure that the choices that the state, or the province in this case, has in mind are implemented, but doing so in a way that market participants, investors, can continue to invest and provide the real dynamism in the market. So a couple of thoughts here on that point. What we're looking at in New England, in the US, is again, markets that are fairly well developed, but what we're trying to get around is there a way to build into those markets the objectives that the states have, the clean energy, the decarbonization, et cetera. And more importantly, looking a little bit over the horizon, how do we work in a system, and I think Kathleen alluded to this very well, how do we work in a system, how do the system operators work, how does really everybody make it work financially and operationally in a system with low marginal cost as really the defining factor. Zero marginal cost, low marginal cost. You no longer have that nice, neat input fuel times heat rate curve that you could make operational decisions on and really plan around. So how do we do that? And I think Ontario is uniquely positioned to address that head on because of the decarbonization and the low marginal costs that you've got so prevalent on the system. One thing I would say is that building into the market an explicit definition of what it means to be clean and how much of the clean attribute you want is a key thing that I would recommend everybody keep in mind. And I think what we're also finding, and several of the markets in the US are experimenting with this, is valuing flexibility, responsiveness. So it's no longer enough to just say it's heat rate times fuel price and everything else sort of is derivative of that. I think we need to be much clearer to talk about the value of being able to respond almost instantaneously in the case of storage and some other things, over a few minutes, over a few hours. What does that kind of responsiveness and flexibility mean? The other point that I would suggest that Ontario think about in terms of the market renewal is, and I'm reminded of a metaphor, vision I had back in the early days of the U.S. Be very, very careful about trying to cross a big gap in 2 steps, because that first step might not take you halfway there. It might take you to the bottom. So I would urge folks to think very carefully about really, looking at what should be in the case of the economics of a market system, and go as close to that as you can. It's clear from a lot of experience, and I think Ontario's experienced this more than many places. The economics of market design is not that hard. The politics of market design is horrific. Understanding that, I would hew as close as you can to the economics, and there are plenty of people to talk about what the right economics are. Look for independence of the market operator and of the decision making to take that out of the political realm, if and as much as possible. I would say that, and that's a prerequisite, that's a threshold. There is a suite of market structures that are needed. We've talked about some of them. Really good energy pricing with scarcity pricing to recognize those periods when energy is short and resources are in scarce supply. Ancillary services, back to that ramping flexibility responsiveness, along with typical operating reserves that markets are well familiar with. Performance-based capacity, so a capacity construct, again, PJM and New England have sort of led on this with a forward market, and then with real-time performance metrics and payments that incent availability when the system really needs it. And I think there's some really, really good designs there. And lastly, I would say that I would look very, very strongly in understanding the legacy in Ontario and the position of folks, is think really hard about market valuing all of those contracts, all of those legacy resources that are out there, because only when you get to everybody on more or less a level playing field with the same kind of risks in terms of where the market's going, will even the governance work right. Everybody's got to be, everybody who's running a power plant, running a contract, needs to have a similar set of incentives. So I would say once you've figured out a governance structure, once you've figured out market rules, look at valuation, divestment, and really look at how you can bring private investment and put the risk on those folks as opposed to keeping it in the GA. So I think I've been well over time, and I apologize for that, but the short message I would suggest is markets work. It takes a lot of work, and largely through the political compromise, both in broader political environment, but also among stakeholders. It's important to work those issues out. But over time, if you keep an eye on what the right economics are and the right economic design is, I think you can, by successive approximations, get to a good market design. We're seeing a lot of investment in the U.S. that I would not have predicted at lower prices than I would have predicted. And I think that's an important data point because it suggests that private investors really are enthusiastic and will come even when sort of the textbook spreadsheet says probably not a good idea. They will come, and I think that's important to keep in mind. When they do that, customers are shielded, which is huge. And this point on retail markets, Texas is probably our premier example. When they're done right, or as completely as possible, they provide tremendous amounts of opportunity for innovation and value. I would, again, recommend, as the guy from away just showing up today, I would recommend look for that third-party investment, look to spread the risk and the innovation out to the third parties as much as possible. Economic incentives work. Take it out into that and put real people's real money at stake, and I think you'll get better outcomes. All technologies should be resource neutral, fuel neutral, et cetera. Build your markets with all of the constraints and objectives that you can think of into them, whether it's flexibility, black start, all of those things. Build in carbon, clean energy, build in all of those things. And I think with a good study of the U.S. markets as well as others across Canada and across the world, I think there are a lot of good lessons out there for Ontario, and I appreciate the time to be here and look forward to questions, and again, apologize for running, I think, long. Jack?
Okay, thanks. Thanks to Adam. I used to sit on the Stakeholder Advisory Committee with Adam, so it's nice to be back here to discuss issues with you of interest on a panel. I would say thank you also to the IESO for inviting me up here to speak about this exciting issue today. As noted, I do sit on the Stakeholder Advisory Committee today, and I like to speak relatively frankly about issues that we see in the electricity space. And so I think to James's point, it speaks volumes about the IESO and how they encourage dialogue, really robust dialogue, even when sometimes those opinions are perhaps different than their own. So thank you. So yeah, we were asked to talk on this panel about decarbonization and the impact on tomorrow's electricity markets, in particular, taking into account what we can perhaps learn from other jurisdictions who are trying to integrate markets and policies. And I think I might flip that question on its head and ask, can Ontario be a leader globally in trying to design markets that include carbon or environmental attributes into their market design? So unfortunately, I probably won't disagree too much with Peter and Kathleen, so maybe that just implies that we've landed on, you know, some good ideas for a path forward. So this slide, again, what's been reiterated with previous speakers, it shows the success we've had in decarbonizing the power system in the province. This is really dramatic. I think this is incredible. This is the success story in this space. We hear a lot of bad press in Ontario about the electricity sector generally, and I don't think we do enough to promote what a great job we've done. We really have been global leaders here in decarbonizing our grid. And again, we should publicize that more broadly inside and outside of the province. The one comment I might make, or the issue I might take with this graph, is it shows projections of carbon emissions going forward, and it shows them maintaining at a very low level. So for those who aren't aware, today we generate over 90% of our electricity from non-emitting resources, nuclear, hydro, wind, and solar. And I think we and others might question during that nuclear refurb period from 2020 to 2030 plus, can we really maintain a carbon emissions profile that's that flat? So that's the good news story. Then the less rosy picture is how did we get here, the cost implications of decarbonizing the system. So again, it's important to note that if you take a bunch of otherwise good assets that are not at the end of their useful life and you decide to retire them to replace them with different types of technologies, to achieve different objectives, clearly you're going to have to incur some costs there. And again, this is something that we could do perhaps more to educate consumers around. But how did we get there? Did we get there in the most cost-effective manner possible, or did we take different non-market routes? And so what we show here is the three main avenues that we've decarbonized the system over the last 10 to 15 years. And these are all out-of-market constructs for replacing coal with other types of assets. So we had a relatively expensive feed-in tariff program. We had a non-market procurement of capacity through long-term contracts with some gas plants that are somewhat unutilized today. And then nuclear expansion and refurbishment, the full costs of which really are not well understood at all today. There's cost projections that are out there, but I think very clearly the risks around those costs are all to the upside. So there's a good news story, and then there's a challenge here around the cost to ratepayers. The bills have come close to doubling over this period of time that we've decarbonized the system. So here's a big complicated slide we put together that shows a couple of paths that we can continue to take going forward. So again, this is it sort of follows on maybe perhaps with Kathleen's three options. There's two here. You can take markets, which are relatively direct, or what's called the whoopsie option, which is a more tortuous and convoluted path to get to the same outcomes. And so to the extent that I would bring up any topics around what we do learn from the US, I think that there is a lot of dialogue down, in particular in the Eastern RTOs, so PJM, New York, New England, around how do you integrate markets and policies. And I think that I'm not a PhD economist like Kathleen, but I think economists on the right and left would agree that markets are the cheapest way to decarbonize your system over the medium to long term. There's some questions around ratepayer impact in the early years, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, but there is broad consensus that if we could do it, markets very clearly would produce least cost outcomes. So where are we today? So there's a quote here around some recent electricity agreements between the province of Ontario and Quebec, where Ontario is looking to procure clean, non-emitting hydroelectricity from Quebec. And so why are they doing this? I think our perspective is, this is back to the first slide that I walked through that shows the path of carbon emissions coming down so successfully, but what does it look like going forward? And I think the base case expectation would be that all else equal, you would fill in the gap during nuclear refurb periods with gas generation. Some people ask, well, doesn't the cap and trade signal address what we want to do environmentally within the province in the power sector? And very clearly, the value of non-emitting generation is significantly higher than the $18 a ton price that we've put recently on cap and trade. And so at $18 a ton, you would still just fill in non-emitting nuclear generation with emitting gas generation, and it would just have a small carbon adder associated with it, but it would still be the least cost fuel of choice in a market that is driving for least cost dispatch, agnostic to whether the generation is clean or not. And I think the other point we would make is we think that's unacceptable politically. And again, this is the big issue, is how do we bring together the policy imperatives that politicians want and what the IESO clearly wants to do, which is to drive towards a least cost dispatch system. And the other thing we would say is we don't think it's just the Liberal Party, as Adam referred to at the outset. The current political party has been in power for a relatively long time in the province, but we think it's unacceptable for all three major political parties to see carbon emissions move meaningfully higher. And so we think that that's important. And so what you've got now is a situation where we know we've gone out of market, it's driven higher costs, but we're back at the same place because I think the government looks and they say, we don't have really great alternate mechanisms to ensure we have clean generation, so we've got to go out and make heavy-handed decisions that are out of market. And so the question we then ask, is there another way that might provide an example where there's been great leadership that impacted the government's perspective on alternatives and paths? And so in this slide, there's another quote that we've pulled out, again, from the Ministry of Energy, where they're directing the IESO to discontinue negotiations with existing NUG gas plants in the province. And why did they do this? They did this because the IESO demonstrated fantastic leadership in saying, well, there is another way. We can use markets. We can look at what's happened for capacity procurement in other jurisdictions, and we can actually go to market and have competitive, transparent mechanisms to allow the NUGs, and we want to make sure we include those great existing resources, but they can compete with each other, they can compete with imports, they can compete with the demand side, and a whole host of other places that capacity will come out of the woodwork and surprise people. And they built credibility up with the government to the point that the government said, hey, that's great, we don't have to take the same path anymore, we can just push this into the market. And so, you know, we would argue that there's the same opportunity here for the IESO to lead, for the market to say, okay, there are alternate ways that we can ensure, if you want to keep that carbon emissions profile low, that we allow the market to compete to do it in the most cost-effective manner. And so just wrapping up, we've got a bit of a dashboard here with some traffic lights, trying to look at where do we think Ontario is from a market design perspective, contemplating should we be bringing environmental objectives into our market mandate relative to what we see in the US. And we really think that Ontario has the chance to leapfrog a lot of jurisdictions and show that leadership I referred to at the outset. A few things we've talked about that can make the job easier or harder. The first is legal authority. So in the United States, FERC oversees a lot of the mandates of the RTOs. A lot of the RTOs cross a number of political boundaries, states, and as we understand it, the Federal Power Act doesn't give FERC the authority to mandate RTOs to include environmental attributes into their mandate. There might be an exception in New York, which, like Ontario, is a one-state political entity, and the CEO at the New York ISO is looking seriously at pulling carbon pricing in and around the levels of the societal cost of carbon, which is well north of what we see with cap and trade, into the market, because they, as we understand it, see that that's a lower cost outcome to decarbonize the system than going out with a lot of direct procurements. In Ontario, that wouldn't be an issue. We don't believe it would be relatively straightforward for a majority government to say to the IESO, you now have the mandate to include the pricing of environmental attributes in a least cost fashion into your mandate and your market design. The second, ratepayer impact, so I talked about this before. This is a big challenge in the United States. While economists agree that the least cost method to bring environmental attributes, carbon pricing into the market over the long term to decarbonize your system is through the market. In the near term, if ratepayers are not paying existing non-emitting resources for all that value of providing non-emitting generation, if you were to just change that market structure overnight, there'd be a huge ratepayer impact, and that's likely politically not acceptable. And so in the US, to the extent that they get there, it'll take a longer time and it will require some level of transition over a period of time to that optimal market structure to manage the ratepayer impact. And that dialogue is happening down in the three markets I referred to. And then the last is just appetite for market renewal. I think Peter could talk about this at length. The constant churn of potential market redesign in the United States is exciting. It's fun for those of us that work in that area, but it's exhausting. And I think that there's perhaps, while there's still appetite, there's some lethargy and just some fatigue, I would say, where in Ontario we haven't had a market for a long time, and it seems to us there's really broad consensus that the time is right to do this. This can drive costs lower. We believe that, we see the politicians both in the leading governing party as well as in the opposition parties saying, we think this is a good idea. So we think that on all counts, Ontario is extremely well positioned. We're going to do market renewal. We can do this. It won't have ratepayer impacts. It's a great opportunity for Ontario to choose a new path forward and really use the markets to continue to maintain and decarbonize the system. So that's me. Thanks very much.
Does the mic just go? Does it just work magically?
Okay, good. What I thought I would do, if you'll allow me a little bit, just to set up a question that we can speak to as a panel. And if you will allow me as well to go back on my idea that we might have an opportunity to speak to the Premier. Imagine she were here. What would we say to her? And in the current context, of course, it's not about what she would do, per se. It's about what she's going to say for the next 12 months, what she's going to do over the following 4 years of the mandate. So we really are talking about, if there's an election in 2018, whichever government is elected then will be in power until 2022. So we're kind of interested in where we're going to be in 2022. And I'm struck a little bit looking at all of the details of the advice that the three of you have brought here in terms of, you know, pricing and capacity and energy and flexibility and the need for this and the need for that. And I wonder if I might challenge you with a paradigm. And the paradigm is this. 30 years ago and more, I worked for the BC government, and I worked in an office where 13 of 15 people were smokers, and we routinely were given ashtrays on our desk. And 25 years ago, after I'd moved to Toronto, I worked for a non-governmental organization campaigning for government policy to restrict tobacco use. So we banned cigarette sales in pharmacies, or we advocated for this. So the Ray government, and Ruth Greer was the health minister, agreed. The vending machines that you used to see in hotel lobbies, we raised the age to 18. There were some labeling things. And in those days, when we were talking about tobacco control, we were all talking about increments. You know, details of where you could and where you couldn't, and if you had an enclosed room, what kind of ventilation, and what all the details were. Now, of course, here we are 30 years later, and the paradigm is that nobody smokes indoors. Nobody smokes indoors anymore. It would be unconscionable or perhaps unexpected, and all heads would turn if someone were to light up a cigarette here. We talk about electricity market design as if we're always going to have fossil fuel and carbon in the mix, and I'd like to challenge you with that paradigm. I think in 2022 we could be, if the Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change can work within government to properly recognize the value of offsets and credits, which are in abundance in this gigantic province of ours, that we could have an electricity system that was net zero carbon. And if it's net zero carbon and there's no fossil in the mix, as it were, nothing to differentiate it as fossil, then the marginal cost of energy is going to be zero, more or less all the time. And in the Market Renewal Working Group, we're talking about location-based marginal pricing, zonal or nodal pricing. But if the marginal cost of energy across the province is zero, then I think that's a new and very interesting challenge. A, how do we get there, and can we get there? With a combination of, you know, offsets and credits and other kinds of things. But how do we properly price electricity to send efficient signals so that the right things get built in the right place by the right people in a world where the marginal cost of energy is zero?
I'll take it. So I think that is such a fascinating question, and I do think it's worth kind of doing that thought experiment. What is your vision of what the electricity sector will look like, and what will prices look like if you really have no carbon emitting resources? I don't think it's right that energy prices will be zero. The supply mix and the supply space is actually much richer and more diverse than that. And when you think it through, what happens is, you know, you really have to start with the right product definition, you know, driven by the need. You start with the right product definitions of what the system needs. Again, and it's going to be the same things we're talking about right now, but what it means will be different in that future. So we're talking about different types of flexibility services, capacity, either clean energy or carbon abatement value, and energy. And that, if you enable all resource types to participate in price formation, you will actually see a really interesting looking market. And what it will look like is energy prices on average will be quite low. But they won't be zero all the time. You have a lot of resources who are bidding on opportunity costs, for example. You're talking about in Ontario, there's a lot of hydro. That's already the marginal resource a lot of times, but it isn't really fully integrated into price formation today. It really isn't fully integrated into that opportunity cost of outputting power at different times of day or providing different products and services. It's the same with demand response and storage. Those are going to be a big part of the mix, and those have opportunity costs. Those have opportunity costs to do other things. You also have interties. where, you know, Ontario, even if it's 100% decarbonized in province, can have a lot of value to being fully integrated with other jurisdictions for energy, ancillaries, and capacity. There can still be a net zero carbon implication of playing on the interties in a big way, or even a positive carbon abatement in the neighboring jurisdictions. But still, the price of carbon needs to be a big part of pricing on the interties. So when you think about all of these pieces come together, you will see energy prices that are kind of all over the place. And you'll see during peak times, prices will be maybe 2, 3, 4, 10x what they are today. While the rest of the time, prices will probably be quite low. Flexibility prices will be high. You know, all of those new products that are coming in to demonstrate the value of flexibility, those prices can be high. Capacity prices might be high. And on net, the total cost of the system still can be lower than it is today.
I think I'd echo a lot of what Kathleen said. I mean, just to set a context, the way we think about this hypothetical future, it's not that dissimilar to what Ontario has today. We don't specifically think about nuclear as being a big piece, but it kind of fits into this bucket that the bulk of the energy for the new system down the road, however far out you want to think about it, is coming from essentially non-dispatchable resources. So it's wind and solar, and you know they're going to produce when the weather resources are there. Nuclear is generally just flat out. Hydro, maybe a little bit more control, but you're talking about those clean energy sources that again have zero to low marginal cost. You're going to probably be using a lot more storage, hydro or otherwise, or batteries and so forth, to balance that out. Demand, we think, is an integral part of helping to balance the equation. And maybe it's a bigger deal in some of the U.S. markets we're seeing, but that duck curve that I talked about in California, and we're beginning to see across the other markets, having demand and storage to really manage the temporal demands for energy and the direction of the flow of energy is going to be really important. And we also, just because we're not really absolutists, don't necessarily think that fossil will disappear, but it probably will be a fairly small margin in response to short-term disturbances, contingencies, and what have you. So we look at that, and I think Kathleen captured it pretty well. You do have certain finite costs, marginal costs going into it. In addition, you have locational aspects. So you have losses on the system, you have congestion on the system, you have opportunity costs. So there are non-zero costs in that LMP structure, and we think that's still important to have as the baseline. But you really do probably tend to rely more on the ancillary services, that balancing function right at the edge is no longer just how much do I tweak the generation up to balance the next increment of load. It's what is going to make that balance work better? Is it moving generation up, moving load down, moving load up? What is it that's going to balance us at the least cost? And those actions, all of that balancing effort is going to have some finite cost to it, and that will roll through in real-time costs. Scarcity, again, if things are getting very tight, we're going to need to react quickly or use resources that are generally less efficient or have high opportunity costs. You're going to see those spiky things. And I do think that whether it's clean energy or capacity as we've understood it in terms of the capacity markets, that kind of fixed or relatively fixed payment for just being there and ready to respond, probably subject to adjustment for how well you actually do respond. But that kind of fixed payment is the kind of thing that makes investment possible and so forth. And ultimately, as Kathleen said, gets you back to a basket of revenues that make investment viable and reasonable. The risks may be changed, the exact sources of that revenue may change, but ultimately they still have to add up for the system to make any sense.
Okay, so again, great dialogue. And Peter and Kathleen talked a lot about different ways that you'll continue to set price signals. I'll take a little bit of a different approach and say that as far as all price signals go, like the future we see is flexible, it's distributed, it's decentralized, and it's clean. And the markets don't send any meaningful price signals to those types of technologies and services today. And we focus on capacity markets, and so maybe this is where I'll have a little disagreement with Peter, is that that's an important component. We would argue that over time, capacity markets become less and less and less relevant and ultimately not relevant at all. To the extent that you continue to have reserve margins of 25, 35, 40%, it's hard to see how you're going to ever have meaningful price signals for anything you want to incent. We continue today to plan most of our systems, with the exception of Texas, with reserve margins that mandate us to add more capacity. And generally what we see RTO's responses to the addition of new renewables is, okay, well now I need to add even more excess reserve margins to make sure that I'm reliable. We would say that we shouldn't think about reliability from a capacity standpoint, then maybe price formation, then, oh goodness, should we price for clean energy attributes? We would rearrange that and say in the future you'll price predominantly for price formation and then clean attributes, and in the rare instances where you have to address reliability issues, you'll look at that last, because you will need to keep the lights on. But in the future, if everybody can do everything that they say they can, and this room's full of all kinds of companies that provide fantastic distributed, clean, demand-side services and products, we don't need to have 20% reserve margin in the system. I think our view is in the future, you'll have much less reserve in the system, and then you'll have meaningful price signals, and you will have all the price signals that these two have talked about, even though you're largely non-emitting, because without big reserve margins, you'll get to periods, and all of those other entities that have non-zero prices will set high prices.
So let me just go back one more time on this, because if you think about 2022, one of the things that I'm struck by, we spend a lot of time talking about pricing policy, but I would say that we spent a lot of time talking about how to price the assets that we used to have, and how we used to do central planning, and how we used to do those large-scale things, and how utilities would bring applications for leave to construct. In the new world, arguably, these investment decisions are going to be made at much smaller scale by many, many more people. If we're talking about distributed energy resources, then these are capital commitments, $1 million, $2 million at a time. These aren't billion-dollar capital commitments. In fact, I don't know who could afford, to take long-term risk on $1 billion of capital, unless you're a nuclear operator with either a regulatory contract or a power purchase agreement. But one of the things I'm interested in, if we can apply technology to enable all of the potential demand response in the market, let's say, all of it, then we have, and I get at the interties and in real time in the balancing market, in the OR market, and maybe even in the marginal capacity market, you're going to get occasionally some scarcity pricing and some transactions at the intertie. You want everything priced in. But if we were, in the next 5 years, to enable all of the potential demand response, not only would energy be more or less free, so would capacity, because we'd have so much of it. We'd have, our peak today is 19 or 20,000, not even 19 in terms of net energy withdrawals. And we have 35,000 of generation capacity. So if we're better at demand response engagement on a hot day like today in 2022, we'll be at 15,000 megawatts, and we'll still have 32,000 megawatts of supply overhang. So, how do we price power? It's not so much what it should be priced at the margin, because at the margin it should be priced at marginal cost. But how do you actually drive the investment you need in reliability, in capacity, when it's so abundant as to be virtually costless?
I think, Adam, I would just question the premise and dig deeper, because when you say, if we enable, take your hypothetical, enable all demand response, well, how do you enable that? Is it just technological? Is it just creating the rules and creating a forum for people to do what makes economic sense to themselves? Or is it an active step, like I think Jack was referring to, where entities, governments, and others step in and say, "Oh, we want more of that, more of that, more of that," and it just adds on and adds on.
Well,
If the markets are unable to rationalize themselves because somebody's, has, the ability to decide whether to make that investment or to retire, absent, some intervention, if they can't rationalize themselves to get to, an appropriate equilibrium. Yes, you're going to have problems. If you overbuild the system, you crash the value of the product. So you have to have the ability to rationalize, either by having your demand set high enough or providing people the means of exit.
Well, and this is sort of my question to you, that if you start with the idea that this is a vision of where we want to be, then what is the pricing signal you send to cause that to happen? And what is that price signal in a market that's largely free of fossil fuels, so there's really no heat curve to speak of, and the carbon tax at $18 a ton is inconsequential. Only a few large industrials actually see any sort of carbon price at the margin. Most everybody sees it on a monthly bill, so it has no meaning, right? So how do you enable that? How do you cause those good investments to be made by the right people in the right place with the right technology in a decentralized world where we don't have central planners sort of trading off this big site versus that big site?
But isn't the issue that at first, if we're in a situation of at least moderate surplus today, first answer is don't do anything, don't add anything, right? I mean that's the first answer. And if nonetheless we decide to add things, well, okay, you're going against the basic economics, and I don't think there is a price signal, and I think that's the unfortunate situation we're in. It's not that LMP is going to magically make it all happen, or capacity will make it all happen, or a clean energy price, cap and trade, what have you, will make it all work. It's that suite, it's that bundle. And I think it's unfortunately, I don't have it in a nice, easy soundbite for you. So.
But I would also say, first of all, I think the market will, better than any central planner, will figure out those opportunities and figure out the best distributed resources to identify. Both the what type of resources, but also the when. Because, in the first years of implementing a market design for capacity is a great example. If you're long on capacity and you put in a capacity market design, it won't attract any new investment. And it shouldn't, right? Because you don't need any more, at least for now. So you have to wait for that price signal to appear when the need comes about. And that's what we saw in PJM. They implemented capacity market. They thought they were going to be short, but enough low-cost stuff came in that it took a decade before prices really got up to the level to attract new generation. From a customer perspective, that's a great thing. From a supplier perspective, folks will not be happy for that decade, some of them. But in the end, that's what the market can do. I think it's the same for clean energy. But from a clean energy and decarbonization perspective, if the need is to stay at the decarbonized level similar to today, that need's going to happen very much sooner, right? Because when the nuclear refurbishments come about, there will be a strong price signal sent immediately for anything that can come in and replace that in a cost-effective way.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add there. I think that Peter touched on a concept that I would, emphasize, which is don't do more of what's not working. So we're in an environment now where load is dropping, and there's a lot of great businesses in Ontario that have an easy job because they can just shadow price the fixed costs of our system, which are very high. And it's a vicious cycle because what it does is it encourages people to continue to drop off the system. And this is what we think will continue to happen. And so that surplus can actually grow a lot. And maybe we can hang our hat on the altar of electrification, and gosh forbid, that might come and save us at some point in time. But for that, we just don't see any way around this. And so I think for markets to work, that at some point they have to end up in balance. And so we would look at some of those multi-billion-dollar commitments around nuclear if we had a chance to talk to the king and say do something differently, or the queen, and say maybe don't make all of these commitments. Looking at what's happened down in the southeastern United States, where Westinghouse, a Toshiba subsidiary, declared bankruptcy with $12 billion overruns. I know we've got good, competent people here in the province, but why we think they're so much smarter than the smart folks at Westinghouse, I'm not sure. So we would say don't do more of what's not working and try to help the market get closer to balance so that market signals for whatever it is you're trying to incent can have a chance to work.
part of the challenge that I'm thinking about is when you look at the primary energy supply mix for Ontario, electricity is the smallest part of it, right? It's it's the least carbon intensive form of energy that we have, that we use. And if we're really going to decarbonize in the province, then it's not about using less electricity. In fact, and it's not necessarily some fantasy about electric vehicles or what have you, but it is about pricing electricity with its clean attributes so that its use can grow to displace energy sources that are not clean, like in transportation or for thermal comfort in homes and hot water. This is most of the almost all the carbon that Ontario emits is imported to Ontario. We buy it from someplace else, right? So it's there's no downside to displacing fossil fuel in this province. We're not a fossil fuel supplier, we're a consumer. And again, it gets back to this challenge of pricing, because at the relative, right now in my home, I pay 21.5 cents per kilowatt hour delivered for power, clean, carbon-free power. In most hours of the year, we have surplus energy and are wasting it. But I pay 2.5 cents per kWh delivered for natural gas. So, if the electricity system is an instrument of policy, if electricity investment is going to drive decarbonization, and we're already carbon-free, and the way we're pricing it now, because it's so relatively abundant in the vertical silo of electricity, right? That, I mean, how do we, again, I come back to this fundamental question of how to price environmental attributes in a way that allows, sorry, and I'm going back and forth a little bit, but I think that the challenge for me is that when we have moments of surplus, we have floor prices. So it's not just signals for scarcity, but we also, to my mind, need signals for abundance. And this is problematic from a policy and political perspective when we have negative pricing. But if we're really going to price electricity to displace fossil fuel, we have to let that market, as you say, go to where it would settle, which is at a much lower number than zero.
I think that trying to break out what the GA is would be a good step in that direction, because it's possible. You can figure out what capacity is worth in the province based on the least cost capacity provider. Environmental attributes, I think it's easy to understand what they're worth and what we value them at today in Ontario. I believe the last IESO auction for new renewables cleared a wind farm around $65 a megawatt hour. So if energy ancillaries and capacity value from that wind farm are $25 a megawatt hour, the environmental attributes for the least cost non-emitting generator in the province today are $40 a megawatt hour, which is around $80 a ton, which is inside of the $50 a ton societal cost of carbon that we see in the US, and under the $100 a ton that I think our Prime Minister referenced as the number you need to achieve Paris 2021, right? So that's what it is. So you could break down the GA, and then you would be able to see, okay, for each resource, what are we paying relative to what it's worth off of relative to a least cost resource today, and then what's extra, and that extra is sort of what I would think of as the out of market portion of what we're paying for.
Yeah, and I'd like to build on that. I mean, the difference between that $80 a ton and the $18 a ton you see in the GHG market. I mean, that's also one of the things that I heard you talking about, which is that mismatch. I mean, because the electricity sector has decarbonized so heavily, a lot of the low cost and medium and high cost opportunities to decarbonize have been achieved in the electricity sector. But the other sectors have a lot to offer potentially. And to really drive electrification, you would need those prices to be similar, right? You need the other sectors at a similar price to the electricity sector if you're going to drive an efficient amount of electrification. And that's actually one of the arguments to have, a uniform carbon price across all economic sectors, which also suggests, but that would suggest basically either amping up the economy-wide carbon objectives or doing something else.
And I think it goes back to the point I made. The economics of this stuff are not that hard, and I am not an economist either. I just play one on TV. But having that uniform price for whatever you want to call it, carbon reduction, carbon abatement, carbon externality, clean energy, whatever you want to call it, having a uniform price so that the market and the many actors in the market, and by that I mean across the economy, find the lowest cost ways to move towards that cleaner objective. That's a huge step, but creating that uniformity, politically very difficult to get that kind of transparency that Jack referred to, but that kind of thing is really fundamental to this stuff. And how you build, and this is where I really am still struggling myself with this market design question, how you build a positive revenue stream around that cleanness, if you will, as opposed to a negative in terms of a tax or even a cap and trade where it creates a cost for emitting carbon. I think when you get to the point where Ontario is so decarbonized as a general matter, the carbon intensity on the system, the number of people paying that tax or fee or what have you, starts to shrink, and the impact on the overall price tends to shrink. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done there, but getting some uniformity across the economy if possible, but certainly across the electricity sector in terms of what you want and what it is worth, or finding ways to establish a numerical target and allowing the market to find the least cost way to get there. I think those are pretty key steps to, I think, what you're describing, Adam.
Yeah, I find it interesting because I talk to customers and I try to explain to them all the incentives that are present in their bill for them to operate more dynamically and more efficiently. And so we play out these scenarios around carbon and the price of natural gas. And I say, well, we have gas plant on the margin and it's going to operate 100 times a year maybe. Maybe it's going to operate in 15% of the hours. I don't know the exact number. There's people here who correct me. I know if I'm wrong. So if we had $4 gas and $80 carbon, then during those peak hours, we'd have $65 megawatt hour marginal cost, however, in the market. Mm-hmm. And it's just an insufficient incentive to drive any behavioral response, let alone any real investment in capacity. So we can go nuts pricing carbon, but unless we see a big fundamental shift in the continental natural gas market, it's still not going to drive anything like the price signal that you'd need to attract investment, even in a CT, which is not the proper reference case.
Yeah, and we've done a lot of work on that, and it's been in a number of presentations that I've done across the U.S. markets and at FERC and so forth, and agree with you that everything we're seeing today, notwithstanding declining prices of solar, declining prices of wind and so forth, you still need to be looking at a pretty hefty carbon price to begin to, and high carbon intensity in the market to begin to see signals that might drive investment. And I think that's why we're, alluded to this idea of a positive revenue stream, be it a forward clean energy market or some kind of a structure that, when I take my solar project to the bank, I can point to as a reasonably reliable revenue stream, not just, well, she's going to have to pay a lot more, that's going to change the marginal price, and that's going to flow to me somehow, but really a much more clear line of sight to the revenues that are going to support financing. So I agree. It's an open challenge for the markets how to do that.
Are there any questions in the audience? Last time there were all these people lined up to talk, and I know there must be some. If you want to line up at the mic. Let me just ask a quick question of Kathleen, maybe, and Peter. Do you see negative pricing in the U.S.? And do you see negative pricing as an ongoing viable component of a competitive electricity market?
Yes and yes. But I think that the thing is we do have negative pricing. Ontario has more of it than most places in the U.S. But I think, we have to be careful about negative pricing because it's a very tricky and nuanced space as to what is the right economics in that situation. The thing is, a lot of times what's driving people to offer at negative prices or very negative prices actually tracks back to, an incentive structure that isn't actually driven by, the economic principles at play. And so that's where a lot of economists end up differing on the exact correct way to do that. So I would say the starting point to addressing negative pricing is actually coming up with really great approaches to incentivizing clean energy production. So the resources that are offering negative wouldn't necessarily offer negative if you structured your clean energy payments in such a way that they're actually incentivizing more production in the hours where they're abating more carbon, because in the negative price hours, they're usually not abating much carbon. Europe has done some work to kind of address this issue basically by, one rule is just don't pay out or pay out less during negative price hours. Another idea that we've proposed in the ongoing process in New England is to structure clean energy payments in proportion to carbon abatement realized. So there are opportunities to address it at the ground level.
Is it peculiar to nuclear, though? I know we euphemistically talk about clean energy, but in Ontario, it strikes me at least that we have the negative prices that we were having were being set because they were being bid in by merchant nuclear. So is that the case in the States?
I think, to expand on Kathleen's point, I think a lot of the negative pricing we're seeing, and I agree with her, yes, and most likely. I haven't totally closed the book on whether we need it going forward, but there's nothing inherently wrong with negative pricing. A lot of it is driven by policy and production tax credits, and a lot of it is being driven, frankly, by inflexibility, because the nuclear plants don't want to cycle. They don't want to come down off full load. They don't want to cycle off. And I think this goes to the bigger question of the future markets, where I think flexibility is going to become the watchword, and you want flexibility, you want to pay flexibility, and you don't necessarily want to reward inflexibility. So whether that, again, is an appropriate driver of negative pricing or negative bidding, it's a good question. But again, there's nothing inherently wrong. You have to dig behind and say, what's driving these parties to bid that way?
I'll take a question from the gentleman.
Yeah, Paul Lacchioni from the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers again. Decarbonizing the electricity system is really quite easy. The reason it's so easy is electricity is so valuable. We're allowed to spend 3 to 5 times more money to build capacity on the electricity system that's clean. That's not the case in the other sectors. In the other sectors, thermal energy is very cheap. And if you want to leverage the electricity system in the other sectors to reduce carbon, you're going to have to find a way to pay for that capacity somewhere other than the energy price. And I'm not sure that's going to be possible and still have the government survive the following election. And the reason is that people are used to very cheap thermal energy. Now, a couple of our generating technologies provide a lot of cheap thermal energy, but they haven't been able to deliver it to the thermal market. Gas and nuclear, 2/3 of their energy is dumped into the environment. I'm not sure if anyone has got any experience with what I would call integrated energy markets, where you're not just doing a market associated with the electricity, which is the easy stuff, but a market that operates on the total energy package. So you pick up the other 80% that's thermal, so that you can get thermal energy at a reasonable price. Because if you try to leverage the electricity system just by switching over to electricity, you're going to triple thermal energy prices. It's going to drive people nuts. It's working in the transportation sector because internal combustion engines are so damn inefficient. They run at less than 10% efficiency on a trip basis, but on the motors and the batteries, you're up at 80%. So you can afford to pay 3 times more per unit energy of electricity on your electric car, and your bill is cheaper at the end of the month. But it doesn't work in industry and it doesn't work in buildings. That's why the Engineering Society has proposed an interruptible retail electricity market to the government, so that the surplus clean energy, which is already paid for by capacity that's required for electricity, the extra then is available free of charge. And then you can start displacing thermal energy at zero cost in the building, the building and the industrial sector. The problem is that a clean energy system only has about 30 to 40% of its total energy surplus. And we've got 4 times more energy on the non-electrical sectors as we do in the electrical sector. So somewhere down the pipe, either technology is going to have to change, or people are going to have to pay a lot more for their thermal energy if we want to remove carbon from the other sectors. It's not really a question, but it's an observation.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you very much. And it's kind of what I was going at as well, which is this question of interfuel pricing. I mean, you know, how to get at the carbon that is there where it is at the lowest marginal cost. It's not in the power system anymore. And we'll take one last,
I want to say one thing, though. I really liked what you said, but I just want to add a caveat, but I think it's a big one, which is if you put on, say, an $80 a ton carbon payment in some form to the other sectors, to gas procurement or so on, the sticker price of that gas may go up by a lot. But keep in mind that the revenue for selling the carbon credits, again, that'll go back to the province, to the government, and that can be given back to customers, consumers in some way. So, you know, the 3 or 4x that you said on the sticker price, the actual net cost to the customers and the province is much lower because that revenue can be used.
We also don't give the money back to consumers directly. We put it into other good ideas.
That sounds like a nice theoretical, giving money back, yeah. We've run a little long. I'm sorry, the actual zero was obscured from view. The light is flashing red. We'll take one more question or comment from the floor, and then we'll break for lunch.
Philip Andres, Next Hydrogen. I wanted to follow up what you said, Adam. I actually view the fact that we have a generation surplus, a clean generation surplus, as a great opportunity. It's a great resource, and we have to get away from the silo thinking of the electricity market and transportation and thermal markets separately. So if we can agree on a policy goal that we want to basically retain the economic benefit of that clean generation in Ontario and maximize its use, so we would agree that curtailment of clean resources is a bad thing, and exporting surplus clean electricity to neighboring markets at subsidized prices is a bad thing. So the goal should be to retain the economic benefit of that in Ontario. And to achieve that, the only way to get there is if we actually are merging the different markets, meaning that transportation and electricity markets have to converge. And in order to do that, we have to go and assign a value to storage. It's like the dark matter of the electricity market. So we should have like a capacity market for energy storage that then allows for a more efficient utilization of the infrastructure we have actually already installed. So if I just wanted to leave you with that and see whether what your ideas would be to actually allow such a market to happen, which recognizes that we can help decarbonize the other segments of the economy and utilize that great resource we already have paid for and installed.
Yeah, I think I don't know if I typically think about it in exactly those terms, but your point about storage, I think, is well taken, and its role in all its forms in the markets going forward. I do think of it as not storage per se, but it's the ability to respond and help to balance the energy market. So whether it's my electric vehicle that's plugged in my garage or at my workplace, or whether it's my water heater or other thermal mass in my building or what have you, the ability to modulate up and down in response to the broader market. And I'm thinking, I come at it from the lens of the electricity market and operations there, but perhaps there is a broader environment or platform, as I think you're suggesting, but that ability to both consume, as needed and give back as needed. I think that's a really important element, and integrating that with the traditional power plants that still exist, the large scale solar and wind, et cetera, et cetera. I think that is a bit of the that's the objective out there.
Kathleen, Jack, any last minute thoughts?